now want to introduce our first two speakers. I will introduce Alyssa Johansen Reuben, who will be moderating and introducing the program. As I mentioned, she is Senior International Correspondent for the New York Times and its former Paris bureau chief. She has worked in conflict zones all over the Middle East. She's been stationed in Baghdad, Kabul, and Vienna, from where she covered the Balkans War, so she's been doing this for quite a while. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Renaissance Studies and Classics from Brown University and a Master's in European History from Columbia. She's written from and worked in 25 countries around the world, throughout Europe, Middle East, and Central Asia. And her awards would take probably 3 hours to recite, and I don't want to use up any of our time. But they include the Michael Kelly Award given by the Atlantic Council for articles on the ongoing plight of Afghan women, the American Society of Newspaper Journalists for public service journalism coverage, the John Chancellor Award for Excellence in Journalism, the Overseas Press Association Award for coverage of female suicide bombers in Iraq, and most importantly, I think, in 2016, she won the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for covering the cruelties suffered by Afghan women. And then immediately after Alyssa gives her opening talk, General Petraeus will be the first speaker. I know that you all know about General Petraeus and his stellar career, who he is. He served over 37 years in the US military, culminating his career in 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, including command of the surge in Iraq, command of the US Central Command, command of coalition forces in Afghanistan, and following his retirement from the military, and after a unanimous Senate confirmation vote, he was named director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He graduated with distinction from the US Military Academy at the top of his class, and at the top of his class from the US Army Ranger School and the US Army's Command and General Staff College. He holds a PhD from Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. He has received numerous awards and medals, including Princeton University's Madison Medalist, 4 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the Bronze Star for Valor, 2 NATO Meritorious Service Medals, and the Combat in Action Badge, the Ranger Tab, and Master Parachutist. I love that because I like parachuting too. And Air Assault badges. He's been decorated by 13 foreign countries and currently serves as a partner with the global investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which he established in 2013. All right, so I'm going to sit down and turn this over to Alyssa Johansen Reuben, and I'll see you later.
Thank you very much, Christy, and thank you all for being here. I want to say how honored I am to be in the company of all these participants. I've spent time usually at a distance, the other end of a press room from most of them, and I had not met Sima Samar in person until today, and I was so glad to finally meet her after hearing so much about her. So I'm just going to spend 20 minutes talking about the history of Afghanistan leading up to the war and some of the dilemmas that the United States face there. With just 20 minutes, I'm going to necessarily speak in very broad strokes, and please forgive me. I know there are people here who know so much more than I do. So this will be, I will leave out details that are certainly important, and I'll speak in very general terms, but just to paint a picture for those of you who might not have spent time on the overall picture of Afghanistan. So although our attention has been, as Christy said, on Ukraine, it's really worth remembering that until just a few months ago, the war on terror dominated our national strategic consciousness. It shaped the United States policies at home and abroad, and it changed unfairly America's view of Muslims. And it drove at least 2 wars that marked the early years of the 21st century, Afghanistan and Iraq. The salvo that spawned the war on terror, there were clearly rumblings before that, but it was the attack on the United States on September 11th. And that was followed on October 7th by the invasion of Afghanistan by the United States and the British, supported by 40 other countries. Before we get into the specifics of the US war the last 20 years, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some deeper history and the sequence of events that led up to the war, because what's past is truly always prologue, and some of the difficulties the United States faced were rooted in choices it made before the Afghan war started and history that it ignored. Then I'll just lay out quickly a few of the problems that the United States faced. There were many more, and I expect that other speakers will talk about them. But some of those problems really crippled the prosecution of the war and the efforts to make a lasting peace. These problems were so profound that after 20 years of fighting, more than $1 trillion in spending, and way more, I believe, than the 120,000 Afghan lives lost. I think probably many more were lost. 3,600 Americans and coalition service members were killed. American troops handed the country back to the Taliban and abandoned a people to whom it had promised long-term support and whose loyalty it had demanded for 20 years. Afghanistan has a long history of being invaded and of ultimately repelling those invaders. We could go back centuries, and it's really interesting to do so. But for now, let's just touch on the 19th and early 20th century, which were marked by 3 wars against the British, followed by a relatively long period of calm in the first part of the 20th century, first middle. Looking briefly at the 19th century, why were the British there? They were partly adventurism, but they were there also to try to ensure it was they that dominated Afghanistan and not the Russians. The country was the gateway to India, which in the 19th century was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and Russia appeared to be encroaching on it. And that period of competition for influence over the area that we now think of as Afghanistan, though it included a broader region, was known as the Great Game. The First Afghan War with the British in 1841 ended with the Afghans decimating the entire British community of several thousand and leaving a sole surviving doctor to ride into the eastern city of Jalalabad and tell the story. Subsequently, the British endeavored twice more to influence the country through ties with rulers that they helped to bring to power. That's a pattern that the United States would to some degree repeat after its own invasion. And in 1919, left the country for good. By 1925, Afghanistan became an independent nation. It had a king, and there was a long period of relative peace and growth. It was still very poor, but a period in which it really developed in a whole variety of ways. It was a period in the 1960s where you'll often hear stories of Western visitors to Kabul, seeing a place where women didn't wear hijab. Some of them wore Western clothes. There were cars, music, parties. It was a city where women went to university and held jobs in government and in healthcare. Seema Samar was one of those women. She went to a co-ed high school in an American-sponsored project in Helmand. She graduated as a doctor, as did many women. Many women graduated as engineers from Kabul University and other schools. But that freedom was much less prevalent in rural areas, in the mountains, and the deserts, in sort of the vast distant areas far from the cities. And there, older, more traditional customs prevailed, and the government's efforts to educate women were often resented and resisted in what was a highly patriarchal and largely, in those places, unlettered society. not necessarily unknowledgeable. There was a great deal of oral tradition there, but there was not what we associate with cities. By the late 1970s, the struggle for influence between the West and the then Soviet Union became, in essence, another version of the Great Game. It was the period of the Cold War. So when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, partly with encouragement from communist-leaning Afghans, the United States lost no time trying to stop them. So in many ways, our story of the United States' recent involvement begins around 1980, 20 years before the actual invasion that we think of as the beginning of the war of 2001. This period, that period of the 1980s and early 90s, was marked by the United States' efforts to foment a rebellion against the Soviets from within Afghanistan. The US cultivated Afghan Mujahideen leaders who resented the communist presence. They helped fund training, arms, madrasas, many of them in Pakistan, and encouraged Pakistan's ISI to do that. The money often went through the Pakistan intelligence. These Mujahideen included both armed leaders who came to be close to the United States and those who were close to Osama bin Laden and others like him. The dangers of supporting people with terrorist ideas was not a major factor in the American calculus at that time. It was the Soviet threat that was paramount. And so they ignored perhaps the risks that they themselves were creating or helping to create. The Soviets withdrew their troops in 1989 and soon after their funding, and this communist-leaning government, which fell, and the Mujahideen leaders who had been backed by the United States took over and began to fight each other for power. And they really plunged the already very poor country into a devastating civil war that was crippled by a corrupt wartime economy, and the physical infrastructure, especially of cities like Kabul, was just smashed to pieces. It was against that backdrop that the Taliban rose, promising peace, transparent justice, and an end to corruption. In 1996, they came to power, and while the United States did not know them well, they were not completely unfamiliar either because of the anti-Soviet fight in the 1980s. And at first, it seemed the Taliban were true to their word of bringing peace and stopping corruption. But almost immediately, they also began to stop women and girls from going to school. And quickly, a more isolationist face emerged. The country, which had been open to the world, closed almost entirely. Televisions and cell phones were illegal. The only independent news source that people heard, and that was often listened to in secret, was the BBC Dare and BBC Pashto service, which had an evening broadcast, which even today, older people in Afghanistan remember listening to in that time. And the United States became actively antagonistic to the Taliban's violent treatment of religious and ethnic minorities, especially human rights abuses of the Hazara and of women who were denied schooling. Women were even denied the ability to travel, even to go to a doctor without a male relative. And they were subjected often to domestic violence and had no recourse. But it was the Taliban's hosting of extremist Arabs and who wanted to attack the United States and others linked to Al-Qaeda that focused the US on the dangers that the Taliban presented. And as most of you know, and many of you probably remember, when the September 11th attacks took place, the US asked the Taliban to hand over bin Laden and his associates. The Taliban leadership refused, and an international coalition soon after began the bombing campaign that toppled the Taliban, and they began to hunt down Al-Qaeda. This was America's third war of intervention in less than 10 years. The first was Bosnia, the second Kosovo, the third Afghanistan, and the fourth Iraq. In each one, if you look across them, America deployed a somewhat different military civilian footprint. And arguably the one in Afghanistan both had the most dramatic temporary successes and then crashed the most spectacularly and tragically. The original goal of capturing bin Laden quickly and of then perhaps getting out of Afghanistan or having a very small footprint fell apart when he eluded capture in the mountains of Tora Bora and disappeared into the Spingar Mountains on the Pakistan border. That he was still alive gave American military and intelligence leaders, but also civilian ones, a justification to remain in Afghanistan since it was there that they were attempting to hunt him down. But that pursuit also morphed into a pursuit against the Taliban. And while a few Taliban had been closely connected to Al-Qaeda and involved with them and its worldwide terrorist mission, most were not. But many were detained nonetheless, and some were taken to the Bagram detention facility, some to Guantanamo, and subjected to torture. Then their family members and close associates would in turn target American and British troops, and it became harder and harder for the Americans to extricate themselves, in part because they were invested in seeing the Taliban as terrorists, and also, to be fair, they were killing American service members. But it was almost as if the two were caught in a spiral that kept the war going and ultimately broadening. So while there's no way to do justice for the whole next 20 years, I'll just lay out a very few broad strokes here. The first 2 years of the American occupation went relatively well. The country was relatively peaceful. As a journalist, I measured my estimation of peace and security by the answer to the question, could I travel safely alone? And by and large, I could, almost everywhere, except at night in the handful of provinces in the Pashtun South that had been the last to come under US and Afghan government control. Still, schools opened in every province, and by 2017, more than 6 million children, perhaps even more than that, there are lots of different figures out there depending on UN or World Bank, but boys and girls were in school. Elections were held, roads were paved, small development projects flourished. But as early as 2004 to 2005, it was clear that the Taliban were inching back. Or perhaps they had never left. They began to reemerge and reclaim some of the power locally that they had lost. And much of their lethal firepower was directed at the US, the United States Afghan allies, at police, at soldiers, at judges, at people that they could reach more easily than the US military. In response to that, the US military footprint broadened, and with it airstrikes that went astray, killing civilians. And repeatedly, bombing strikes that were intended to weed out Taliban cells ended up killing civilians as well, or occasionally, horribly, only civilians were killed. I remember a group of 9 boys tending sheep on a hillside who were killed probably completely by mistake. Inevitably, when the US was targeting the Taliban, there was faulty intelligence. And especially in the early days, the US was sometimes duped into killing people whom informants said were Taliban, but really it was to settle local scores. As innocent people died, Afghans quickly in those areas became quick disillusioned with the US promotion of democracy and with its Afghan government partners. That hostility could not be erased by the blandishments of further development projects. The problem was that with every civilian casualty, every night raid, every person detained arbitrarily, and many of those happened in areas where the government was weakest and the Taliban had roots, the US undermined its message about democracy and justice. How could small projects offered by day make up for the loss of a breadwinner or a child or even if the child was injured and not killed by night. The growth of corruption also undermined the US mission. Certainly corruption existed before the United States came to Afghanistan. And in fact, it had been its proliferation during the early 1990s among the disputing warlords that was one of the reasons the Taliban were initially accepted, because they promised to get rid of it. But the huge infusion of money into Afghanistan brought about by all the US development efforts and the even larger military contracting necessary to build and supply distant bases raised opportunities for graft to unprecedented levels. As US intelligence flowed into the country, those people came with bags of cash to buy information and safe passage. The military followed with many times as much money, but in the form of contracts. This was untold wealth in an impoverished country, and much of it came with few strings attached, especially at the beginning. Those that grabbed most of it tended to have ties of one kind or another to the US-backed government. Bribery became ubiquitous at every level of society, from the lowest to ministers. Almost every government job had a price tag, and once paid, the person had to find a way to make back the money which they had to expend to get the job. And they did that by demanding paybacks or kickbacks themselves for government services. For a rural farmer who might want to adjudicate a land dispute or recoup stolen livestock, it was almost impossible. He would have to pay the police or maybe the judge or any other local person involved. Often he would have to borrow money to do that and spend the money that he might have that he would have had if only he hadn't lost the item to begin with. Importing any goods from Pakistan or Uzbekistan also had a price, and so did exporting. These might have been term taxes or fees, but they went into the pockets of individuals, not back to the state to help people the Afghan people as a whole. The graft was so serious that many projects ran out of money before they were even done, leaving schools half-built, roads unfinished, clinics without equipment. It reached the point where the United States was unwittingly funding the Taliban, who would be hired by Afghan security guards to attack convoys in order to demonstrate the need for the Afghan security guards to guard the convoys, which were doing resupply for US bases. In a different kind of case, I wrote about a road repair project in eastern Afghanistan where the Haqqani terrorist network netted millions of dollars in protection fees, but the road itself, which was a USAID project, was so poorly repaired, even after $175 million worth of work, it fell apart almost immediately. By 2016, some $113 billion had gone into reconstruction, more than was spent on the entire Marshall Plan updated, and much more, some $800 billion had been spent altogether on military logistical contracts. Now, clearly, not all of that went in corruption. The military was there and much was built and people were supplied and fed, but we're talking enormous amounts of money. All of this turned a lot of Afghans against the United States and its hand-selected Afghan leadership, which rarely held to account any of its own. Many people came to see the Afghan government as predatory, arbitrary, and abusive of human rights. The US, backing of figures known as abusive, then also turned more people against the US, especially in areas where the Taliban were strongest. For instance, some American leaders in Afghanistan, and I can imagine maybe some people here may argue with me, but they saw the longtime Kandahar police chief, Abdul Aziz, as key to keeping the Taliban at bay. However, he also built an empire with kickbacks for every truck that crossed the border to and from Pakistan. He made money on a whole variety of illegal networks that were connected to the opium trade. And he was said to kill rivals and torture prisoners. There were numerous documentation by Human Rights Watch and the UN. This was not a secret, and most US officials were reluctant to move against him. And part of what gave Razik his power was his impunity as a result of his US background. I'm using that as an example, but he was not the only one. And the tacit acceptance of characters like this undermined the United States' purported support for the rule of law. I'm detailing here a lot of the byproducts of the United States presence that undermined its support and that of the Afghan government that it was trying to sustain. But there were, of course, many ways in which the US presence had a beneficial impact, particularly in the largest cities, in Kabul, in Mazar-e-Sharif, in Herat, where the benefits of having employment, not just from the government, touched many, many people. There were many Afghan NGOs. There were also international NGOs. There were organizations like my own newspaper, which had jobs and helped raise probably the standard of living and tried to and opened a bit people to a larger world and to different ways of doing things. The availability of education was especially expanded in urban areas, as well as projects protecting women. But ultimately, none of these benefits were sufficient to offset the toll taken by everything else. Sadly, once the US military began its final drawdown in 2019, the impact of corruption, which often siphoned off enlisted men's salaries, food rations, and equipment, became frighteningly apparent. It was exacerbated by the withdrawal of US air support, which the Afghan military had relied on heavily, and the intelligence capabilities that the US shared with the Afghans. And some people chose not to fight, and some had truly lost hope. That gave an added push to the Taliban, and they rapidly gained control of first districts, then provinces. And by the time they walked into Kabul on August 15th, 2021, the ending was a near mirror image of the beginning, but this time with the Taliban in the driver's seat. More than 100,000 Afghans who helped the United States directly as interpreters, working in various US-funded projects, and so many other ways were left behind. Some are in mortal danger today from Taliban reprisals. Some have already disappeared. An entire nation is in the hands of a government that is unable to offer services and without money or capacity to do much of anything for its people. Saddest of all, perhaps for me, is that the education for girls above the age of 12 has effectively ended. And so have almost, I would say, all protections for women and minorities, the very people that the United States had truly aspired to help. I will stop on that rather sad note and turn it over to General Petraeus to pick up the story of what made it so very hard.
Thank you, Alyssa. Well, thank you, Alyssa. I hope you all can see and hear me there. Ryan, if you'll give thumbs up, I will continue. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for that superb précis, Alyssa. Thank you, Christy, for the kind introduction and for your leadership in pulling this all together. And thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this important event and for the true privilege of joining Alyssa Reuben, who so brilliantly and courageously covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then Iraq again. Former Minister Masoom Staniczai, a highly valued partner over the years in Afghanistan. Former Minister Sima Samar, a truly admirable champion of women's and all human rights in Afghanistan. And of course, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, my incomparable diplomatic partner during the surge in Iraq. Later, the ambassador in Afghanistan, having been there at the outset as well, and in my view, clearly the greatest diplomat of his generation. And my apologies for being unable to be there in person due to a surgery that has stubbornly refused to heal properly. I was asked to address the military campaign in Afghanistan, a campaign that I was privileged to observe from several vantage points. First, while conducting an assessment in September 2005 on my way home from my three-star tour in Iraq at the request of Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. Later, as commander of U.S. Central Command, the position I held during the Obama administration policy review and early implementation. Subsequently, as the commander of the International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and then as director of the CIA. And then finally, over the past 9 years, as a member of a Brookings task force and a more than interested observer and commentator. In sum, though I was not engaged in Afghanistan in the early years, I was fairly heavily engaged over the final 15 years of our involvement there. To address the military campaign this afternoon, I will not provide a chronological history of our military campaign, highlighting the extraordinary service of our men and women in uniform, together with our talented and equally committed diplomatic, development, intelligence, and other partners, and chronicling the successes and setbacks, achievements, and missteps. Rather, I'll approach my assignment by offering an assessment of why we, in essence, ultimately underachieved in Afghanistan, despite the selfless, courageous, professional, and determined service of our military and civilian members, and that of our coalition partners and innumerable great Afghans. In fact, I'm working on a piece for publication on this subject, and what follows is an adaptation of it. Up front, more than 6 months on from the chaotic scenes at Kabul airport last August, with the shift in focus to the invasion of Ukraine notwithstanding, the ultimate outcome in Afghanistan still appears to me to be heartbreaking, tragic, and disastrous. The Afghan government that collapsed was, to be sure, maddeningly imperfect and a source of endless frustrations. Yet it was also an ally in America's effort to combat Islamist extremists in Central Asia. It celebrated many of the freedoms we cherish, and it wanted to ensure them in an appropriate manner for the long-suffering Afghan people. That government was certainly preferable to what replaced it and what followed, leaving a country of nearly 40 million people, individuals we sought to help for 2 decades, condemned to a future of privation and repression. The fact and manner of America's departure also enabled our adversaries to claim that the United States is an undependable partner and a great power in decline. That is not trivial in an era in which deterrence is of growing importance, nor is the fact that we left behind, abandoned, as Alyssa rightly put it, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of those who shared risk and hardship along the way with our soldiers, diplomats, development workers, and spies, and whose lives are now endangered, along with the lives of their family members because of that service. In my view, it did not have to turn out this way. I do not mean simply that there were affordable alternatives to withdrawal that were not truly considered in the end, alternatives that would have led to far better results than what we see today, though there were, and they would have. Rather, I mean that it did not have to be this way at all, that over our 20 years of enormous investment and sacrifice in Afghanistan, we made significant mistakes and fell short over and over. And had we avoided or addressed quickly enough our missteps along the way, the options for our continued commitment to Afghanistan would have been much more attractive to successive administrations in Washington and might have precluded withdrawal entirely. The grim reality was that, as many of us did caution along the way, Afghanistan was never going to transform into a prosperous liberal democracy in the foreseeable future. Nonetheless, for all its flaws and shortcomings, and despite deterioration in the security situation in the final years, it was at least broadly trending in the right direction. Moreover, as a result of our intervention in late 2001, we had a responsibility to continue to help it along that path, however long it took. What follows is not an exercise in relitigation or finger pointing. Neither is it about absolving myself. As I noted at the outset, I was as much a part of our efforts in the middle years in particular as anyone else. My purpose here then is to contribute to an effort to learn from our experience in Afghanistan. That is an imperative. Faced with a revanchist Russia, a more assertive China, an aggressive Iran, and numerous elements of Islamist extremists in various places around the world, more and more of our allies and partners look to us for resolve and a commitment to fight aggression and terrorism, as well as to promote the democratic values we hold dear and recently celebrated with a virtual summit on democracy hosted by President Biden. To sustain our position as a leader of the Western world, we must understand why one of our signature campaigns resulted in such unending frustration. There were, in essence, many failings over our 20 years in Afghanistan, none of which occurred in a vacuum. Overall, they can be broken down into three broad issues. There is the fact that for 2 decades, we did not seem to understand, acknowledge, or affirm the depth and nature of our commitment to Afghanistan. Rather, we were always shooting behind the target, reacting to the enemy rather than getting ahead of the situation and staying there. Then there is a related fact that even for the brief period where we did seem to grasp the awesome responsibility we held, we did not allocate sufficient resources for sufficient time or properly to ensure our success. And finally, there is the fact that despite all of our time in Afghanistan, we never truly came to appreciate sufficiently the local and regional dynamics at play. Now, these are of necessity generalities. Certainly, there were periods during which we made progress and actually accomplished the missions assigned to us. I do think that was true of the periods when Ambassador Crocker and I were privileged to serve there in the 2010 to 2012 or 2013 period, though the cost was considerable. And certainly there were individuals by dint of long service in Afghanistan and aptitude for the tasks at hand who did achieve the granular understanding of the situation we confronted. Carter Malkasian, for example, comes to mind, and he was by no means alone. But in one of the many differences from Iraq, where so many of us served for so long, I was, for example, in Iraq for 4 of our first 5.5 years there, and then oversaw it for 19 more months at Central Command. The nuances of Afghanistan, however, remain more elusive to those deployed there, in part because we did not, broadly speaking, have quite the repetitive tours or lengths of tours that we had in Iraq, and also because Afghanistan was, in various ways, even more inscrutable to us than was the land of the 2 rivers. I should note up front my belief that we were right to invade Afghanistan when we did, eliminating the sanctuary in which al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks and toppling the regime that refused to deal with it. Unseating the Taliban showed our enemies that we would not tolerate those providing a haven for terrorists who attacked our country and killed our countrymen. Our subsequent efforts also showed that we believed in the promise of freedom and democracy, that these values are universal, however difficult it may have been to implement them in the shadow of the Hindu Kush. Though Afghanistan was not going to become Switzerland in 1 generation or even 3, its people did broadly crave the basic freedoms so many hold dear: to speak freely, to have their property protected, to educate their children, and to enjoy the rule of law. And they repeatedly expended great effort and even risked their lives to exercise their democratic rights to vote and have a say in who their leaders would be. So my focus here is contributing to an imperative that even as we recognize the enormous good work and laudable aspirations in Afghanistan, that we also acknowledge and understand the shortcomings of our long campaign there and appreciate what we got wrong, for how long, and at what cost. If I had to point to one issue that we never fully overcame, a foundational mistake never entirely corrected when it came to American and by extension, Western efforts in Afghanistan, it was our lack of commitment. In essence, we never adopted a sufficient, consistent, overarching approach to which we committed and resourced from administration to administration, or even within individual administrations. We were reluctant even at the outset of the intervention in Afghanistan in late 2001 to plant a flag there, figuratively and also literally. We were unwilling even to establish a substantial military headquarters on the ground. And even then, after we did, by deploying the 18th Airborne Corps commander in his headquarters, we quickly shifted focus to Iraq and made Afghanistan an afterthought. By the time attention and resources were once again truly devoted to Afghanistan, some 8 years after the initial invasion and following completion of the surge in Iraq, we had missed a many years long opportunity to take advantage of a protected period of low violence in Afghanistan, during which time the Taliban and other insurgent elements regrouped in Pakistan, and during which we could have made much greater strides in developing Afghan forces and institutions than we did. As Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, often observed after taking office in late 2007, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. Frankly, what we can was never remotely enough. In fact, when I conducted the assessment in Afghanistan in September 2005 that I mentioned earlier, I was struck by how far behind Iraq Afghanistan was. Even though our special operations heroes on horseback, intrepid intelligence officers, and American air power had toppled the Taliban regime more than 15 months prior to our invasion of Iraq. To be sure, after the policy review in the fall of 2009, by late 2010, and for a relatively brief period, we finally did get the inputs roughly right, some 9 years after the initial intervention. And by inputs, I mean the following: the right big ideas and overarching strategy for a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, including for the first time sufficient forces to halt and roll back the Taliban momentum, major adjustments to the effort to train and equip Afghan forces, the establishment of a structured transition program, an organized effort to reconcile, called reintegration at the time, and by the way, Masoom Staniksai was one of the leaders of this, with the Taliban rank and file while negotiations commenced with the leadership of the Taliban and other insurgent groups, initiation of the village stability operations and Afghan local police programs, a substantial comprehensive initiative to reduce civilian casualties, a sufficiently resourced rule of law effort, and a variety of complementary civil military programs to build the critical institutions at the national and provincial levels that would be needed to enable the commencement of transition. The inputs also included, for the first time, establishing the right organizational structures and elements required to implement the big ideas, including a U.S. force headquarters along with the NATO International Security Assistance Force headquarters, the 3-star operational level headquarters, several anti-corruption task forces that were much needed, a counter-narcotics task force, the rule of law field force, the Afghanistan-Pakistan HANDS program, the Special Operations Task Force to oversee the Afghan local police program, and so forth. And very importantly, the inputs included roughly the right level of military, diplomatic, development, intelligence, financial, and other forces and resources needed to carry out the strategy. Indeed, all the rest depended on getting those sufficient resources. Finally, the inputs included the right preparation of forces and leaders for deployment to Afghanistan, an effort that had required a years-long effort to improve the so-called road to deployment for our military forces. In particular, forces which, as I noted earlier, did not generally have the substantial level of experience on the ground in Afghanistan that our leaders and soldiers had after repetitive tours in Iraq, which was also, for Afghanistan's or for Americans at least, a more understandable place and people than were Afghanistan and the Afghans. Unfortunately, the period during which we had all the inputs roughly right lasted less than a year. For as it became clear that we could not deliver a knockout blow to the Taliban or other extremist groups, we ultimately decided that withdrawal was preferable to stalemate. Basically, we reverted to what became our standard operating procedure in Afghanistan. Not long-term nation building, but repeated exit seeking, even though, to be sure, nation building did continue. And here, if I might, for those who might contend that we shouldn't have engaged in nation building, I would ask how, once you have intervened as we did, how else do you hand off critical tasks, such as denying sanctuary to terrorists, securing the population and infrastructure, and running the country and its myriad institutions? How do you do that if one does not train, equip, advise, assist, enable, develop, and resource host nation forces, and also do the same for critical government institutions? Nation building was not just unavoidable, it was critical. And our continued questions about whether we should be engaged in it were more than short-sighted. They were just plain foolish, though I'll acknowledge that we needed to be careful about nation transformation. Sadly, when we recognized that we couldn't win the war in Afghanistan, we did not even seriously consider that we might just manage it. In fact, some of us had warned that we would not be able to do in Afghanistan what we had done in Iraq during the surge. I was one of them, and explained that while we might be able to drive violence down year on year, as we did, we would not be able to flip the country as we had in Iraq. That is, to dramatically reduce the violence and provide Afghanistan a whole new beginning. That just was not achievable in Afghanistan, as the conditions and context were very different, and in many ways, much more intractable and challenging than those in Iraq, even though the levels of violence never approached those of Iraq. To be sure, managing rather than winning would have required a sustained generational commitment, one that would have continued to be frustrating and inevitably less than ideal. But it would have been vastly better than leaving the country and 40 million Afghans to the Taliban and its allies. Now, it's also very important to note that the lack of sufficient commitment over the years had innumerable knock-on effects. Needless to say, having leaders of successive US administrations stating that we wanted to draw down and leave, often regardless of the conditions on the ground, undermined our negotiating position with the Taliban and had a corrosive impact on our relations with our Afghan partners, our allies on the ground, and the countries in the region, especially Pakistan. These effects were substantial and quite pernicious. Moreover, the ultimate deal that we reached with the Taliban, which we agreed without the elected Afghan government at the table, has to rank with the worst diplomatic agreements to which the US has ever been party. We acquiesced to Taliban demands because it gave us, in the narrowest sense possible, what we wanted: a defined time for our departure and a Taliban promise not to attack our forces, which was already quite difficult to do, as by that time American soldiers were seldom on the front lines. Of course, our enemies knew we wanted to leave because our leaders had repeatedly expressed that desire. And knowing that, the Taliban realized that they had to give up little of value in return. In fact, to induce the Taliban to agree to what they wanted, our departure, we agreed to force the Afghan government to release over 5,000 Taliban detainees, many of whom returned to the Taliban's ranks and helped enable the offensive that toppled the Afghan government after our final forces withdrew. Throughout, but particularly in the final few years of our involvement in Afghanistan, we also repeatedly failed to realize the damaging effects of our stated desire to leave on the psychology of Afghan political and military leaders and on those in the rank and file. After all, why should they truly partner and invest in the solutions we promoted if we were leaving soon anyway? Given our lack of appreciation of the effect of our rhetoric and our actions, we thus failed to anticipate that Afghan forces, who until then had fought very bravely and hard and sustained battlefield losses that were some 26 times those sustained by American troops, could suffer a collapse in the face of simultaneous Taliban offensives around the country, when it was clear to those forces that neither the US nor Afghan forces were coming to the rescue. The latter because of inadequacies in the Afghan plan and degradation in the capabilities of the linchpin of the Afghan strategy, its Air Force. Ultimately then, it all came down to a lack of the American strategic patience that was required to adopt a sustained, sustainable posture in Afghanistan. Indeed, this was true from our earliest moments in Afghanistan through to our final ones there, when we could have, instead of withdrawing, adopted an approach that committed some 3,500 US troops on the ground enabled by an armada of drones and combined with the 8,500 coalition forces already deployed there from countries that mostly wanted to stay, as well as the approximately 18,000 critical maintenance contractors needed to develop Afghan capabilities and ensure their equipment was properly maintained. The latter was especially important when it came to the sophisticated US helicopters we provided, the most critical element of the Afghan security forces, as those air assets enabled delivery of the Afghan reinforcements and close air support needed around the country when Afghan ground forces were attacked. In essence, then, from the beginning through to the end, perhaps especially at the end, American strategic patience was lacking. On a closely related point, for 20 years in Afghanistan, in tandem with our lack of strategic patience and as a result of it, we also clearly fell short when it came to resource allocation. Not only did we not devote enough of our forces and other resources consistently, we also improperly allocated what we had, and we often failed to appreciate or at least provide what our Afghan partners actually needed. As I noted earlier, it took until late 2010 for us to finally commit roughly the level of forces that were necessary to the effort in Afghanistan, whether from a military or civilian point of view. And we only kept the military component of those resources in place for a year or so before beginning to draw them down. Beyond that, however, we often threw money at problems and tried to do too much too quickly. I was party to this. In part, of course, this is because we knew that we were always on a path to withdrawal. And so we needed to move fast while we had the funding and resources required to enable certain projects. This contributed to the development of a wartime economy that attracted more Afghans to major metropolitan areas than could be sustained. It also unquestionably contributed to corruption, which in fairness, we tried to identify and combat, though it was a cancer that proved hard to root out. And it led us to rush to complete projects using Western concepts, designs, materials, and construction methods that ultimately would prove difficult to maintain, rather to embark on projects with Afghan designs, materials, and construction methods that might take longer to complete, but would be more sustainable over time. We also didn't always deliver what the Afghan military needed or should have had. Instead, we opted to give them what we thought they needed, and under pressure from the US Congress, we sought to buy American. This is both understandable and in a number of cases unwise. In particular, we made the Afghan security forces heavily dependent on overly sophisticated US provided air assets that were more technically complex than they could maintain without help from thousands of Western contractors. Ironically, the Afghan forces might have been able to carry on without the 12,000 or so US and coalition forces that departed, but they could not do so without the more than 15,000 contractors who helped keep the Afghan air fleet and other US provided systems operational. And once the readiness of the helicopters began to erode, the operational construct for the Afghan military was no longer valid. And here it is important to note that it is hard to envision any other security force construct than what was adopted, with regular Afghan forces deployed around the nation, protecting population centers and critical infrastructure, and with a substantial component of some 30,000 special forces as a reserve to be deployed in response to attacks on the regular forces. For those who suggest that we should have made the Afghans more like the insurgents, it is very important to remember that the Afghans were, by necessity, the counterinsurgents and had to defend population centers and infrastructure. That was not optional. In that construct, the Afghan Air Force became the critical element. Afghanistan is obviously a large, very mountainous country with limited road infrastructure. As a result, aerial capabilities were essential to transport reinforcements, provide medical evacuation, deliver emergency resupply, and provide close air support for forces fighting on the ground. But we need not have forced US helicopters in particular on them, and should instead have helped them buy or maintain more of the refurbished Soviet and Russian systems that they were experienced with, and which are much easier to maintain and keep operationally ready. Again, This was particularly true of the rotary wing fleet, which was still comprised of Russian systems when I was the commander, as I recommended. The inability of the Afghans to maintain the sophisticated Black Hawk troop helicopters in no small part contributed to the collapse of the Afghan military last year. As the Afghan Air Force's readiness degraded in the wake of our departure, including the departure of Western military contractors who mostly left when American troops did, the Afghan military was unable to respond to the multiple simultaneous Taliban attacks with troops, resupply, medical evacuation, and air attack. The Afghan soldiers realized fairly quickly that no one was coming to the rescue, and the result should not have been a surprise. In fact, I noted well prior to the end that I feared a psychological collapse of the Afghan forces if they came to recognize that reinforcements and air support were not coming. And that is what transpired. Though I should also note that the failure of government leaders in Kabul to design and implement a realistic defense plan, and then to provide the kind of energy, example, direction, and inspiration that President Zelensky and his ministers have provided in Ukraine, the lack of all that was also a major factor. Compounding these two issues, the lack of strategic resolve and a failure to commit the resources, both in the appropriate type and required quantity, was the fact that we often lacked a sufficient understanding of the local and regional context with which we were dealing. At the highest levels, we likely saddled the country with governing structures and principles that gave more power to the central government than should have been the case, and probably missed opportunities to incorporate reconcilable elements of the Taliban in the early years of our intervention. Finding the right balance between Kabul and Afghanistan's provinces and districts has always been a difficult endeavor in Afghanistan's history, to be sure, but we likely did not get it sufficiently right, particularly in our early years there, though I look forward to hearing from Ambassador Crocker on this point and defer to him on it. Moreover, we also undermined the effectiveness of Afghan leaders at various levels by working around them rather than by empowering them, and by conducting military or civilian programs that did not have their full buy-in, either because we did not trust them or did not think them capable of assisting. And despite considerable efforts to avoid mistakes in our military operations, as Alyssa noted, we inevitably took actions that resulted in civilian casualties and made other mistakes that strained local relationships. Some of our operations did create more enemies than they took off the battlefield, despite increasing emphasis on avoiding such outcomes, and they put considerable pressure on Afghan leaders that accumulated over time. The friction on this issue was very substantial and a stubborn one to eliminate. Of importance as well, we repeatedly failed to convince or compel Pakistan to eliminate the sanctuaries on its soil established by the Taliban, the Haqqani Network, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, and other extremist and insurgent networks that carried out campaigns and attacks in Afghanistan. We were also never able to sufficiently disrupt or degrade those sanctuaries with unilateral operations due to Pakistani limits on our activities. In fact, those sanctuaries were likely the most crippling aspect of the context in which we and our coalition allies and Afghan partners operated. As I reflect on the myriad challenges of Afghanistan, in fact, the sanctuaries were the most important of the many differences between our two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that difference, more than all of the others, was likely the one that ultimately meant that we could not achieve in Afghanistan what we had accomplished in Iraq during the surge and the several years immediately following it. Here too, though, our public statements about wanting and intending to leave Afghanistan likely undermined our efforts to get Pakistan to take action. The Pakistanis sensed that at some point the US would depart Afghanistan, whether or not the conditions warranted such action, and knowing that, did not want to antagonize groups that would likely end up ruling at least part, if not all, of Afghanistan. Once again, then, we return to the issue of inadequate strategic patience. There are plenty of other reasons why we ultimately underachieved in Afghanistan, to be sure. There were overly rosy assessments of the situation in the country at various junctures, especially in the years prior to our ultimate withdrawal. and these set against the violence that followed undermine the confidence our leaders and citizens had in our ability to achieve our objectives. There were also, of course, many failings of the Afghan government itself, some of them incredibly frustrating episodes involving government formation, major malfeasance by immediate family of top government leaders, and self-inflicted political crises that sapped support in Kabul and in Washington, not to mention throughout Afghanistan. Finally, there was the seemingly endemic corruption that over time led many Afghanistans to be disillusioned by promises made by their leaders. Those issues pose lingering questions about whether we could have and should have done more to rectify those shortcomings, or whether they were inescapable and damaging features of the overall endeavor. But at the end of the day, it was the three issues I have described: our lack of strategic resolve, our unwillingness to commit the resources required and in various respects to allocate them properly, and our failure to appreciate fully the country and region in which we were operating. These precluded achieving a better situation than ultimately was the case. For despite all the challenges and mistakes I have described, I do believe that we could have achieved a better outcome. We could have capitalized better on the valiant, dedicated, and selfless service of the military and civilian members who sought to help Afghanistan realize the promise held out at the beginning of our mission there. And we could have avoided letting down, abandoning the tens of millions of Afghans who also selflessly and courageously sought to contribute to their country, their communities, and their families. It goes without saying, again, that we very much need to learn from what transpired in America's longest war. For while we may understandably shrink from such ambitious endeavors again, there are numerous situations in which these lessons will be of value. Irregular warfare in various forms has certainly not disappeared from the world, nor have the ambitions of autocrats such as Vladimir Putin, who have proven they will intervene in disputes well beyond their borders or invade countries that aspire to align with the West, as many Afghans certainly wish to do. Beyond that, one clear lesson of the past 20 years should be that Islamist extremists will seek to exploit ungoverned or inadequately governed spaces in the Muslim world, and thus we need to keep pressure on them, albeit as efficiently and as economically and as precisely as possible. And that is largely what we are doing in Iraq and Syria and various parts of Africa, among others, and what we will have to do in Afghanistan, where the lack of any bases, not just in Afghanistan, but in all of Central Asia, will make the task very challenging. In each of those situations now, enabled in particular by the constellation of drones we can put in the sky, we are successfully training and equipping, advising and assisting, and enabling local forces as they do the fighting on the front lines, allowing achievement approaches that are sustainable, at least as measured by the metrics of blood and treasure, even if the process of achieving desired outcomes is painfully slow and full of setbacks as well as successes. In the case of Afghanistan, sadly, what is likely to transpire looks to be exceedingly dire, and the situation there will likely ensure the country remains a significant concern for America. In fact, it will, at the very least, require continued military, diplomatic, development, financial, and humanitarian resources and attention so the Islamist extremists are not able to reestablish sanctuaries, but also so that Afghans do not experience the widespread starvation and so that refugees from Afghanistan do not become the kind of enormous problem for our regional partners and European allies that Syrian refugees became in the previous decade. The desire of multiple US presidents of both parties to end endless wars and focus on nation building at home rather than abroad is more than understandable, especially for those such as myself who actually served in those wars and know firsthand the costs and sacrifices of them. The problem is that it is not clear that our withdrawal from Afghanistan has ended the endless war there, or even ended our involvement in it. And there is nothing to say we won't get drawn back in some fashion. As my great colleague, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, there with you and soon to speak, used to observe, you can leave the movie theater, but the movie continues to roll. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Petraeus. That was very important and comprehensive. We're going to be talking about your presentation for the rest of the day. Thank you. I'm going to turn this back over to Alyssa Reuben, but I want to introduce the next speaker briefly. His Excellency Mohammed Massoum Staniczai, the former Chief Peace Negotiator of the Islamic Republic, former Chief of the National Directorate of Security in Afghanistan, former Acting Minister of Defense, and the head of the Joint Secretariat of High Peace Council, Deputy of the Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration Commission in Afghanistan. And those of you who have taken my post-conflict justice and the rule of law class will recognize a lot of the themes that we are hearing the speakers discuss today, including the one we are about to hear from Mr. Staniczai. In Afghanistan, he was also responsible for the disbandment of the illegal armed groups. He served as Minister of Telecommunications and one of the first members of the Human Rights Commission. He holds a master's degree in philosophy and engineering for sustainable development from Cambridge University and a master's in business management from Preston University, as well as a BA from Kabul and a degree from the Kabul Military University. He's also served as a senior fellow for the U.S. Institute of Peace, one of the very important partners for the Center for Comparative Legal Studies and Post-Conflict Peacebuilding. Your Excellency, thank you very much for appearing. I wish we had you in person, but we're grateful for your presence by Zoom, and I will turn this over to you. I will then sit down again, and Alyssa is going to, I'm sorry, I don't mean to stand in front of you, lead 20 to 30 minutes of a colloquy, a discussion, a question and answer. These topics are provocative. There are going to be a lot of different perspectives in the room on these topics, and even perhaps among the speakers. I'm asking you to give everyone the traditional William and Mary polite welcome. This is an academic forum. We encourage honest, provocative questions, either in writing or in person. Please be polite and show the decorum that we are accustomed to at this law school. Thank you.
Christy, just to, so when His Excellency finishes, then we'll start the questions. I will probably just ask one or two to start out, but the point is for everyone here who has questions to be able to raise them.
And we have some that have already been posted online. And if you have cards that you want to pass to the end of your rows, that's fine. We are obviously not going to have time to answer everybody's questions. And we do encourage people to raise their hand and ask in person. And our panel will decide which questions to answer. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon to everybody. And thank you very much, Christy, for this opportunity, and also Alyssa for a very good account of the Afghanistan history. I'm very pleased to see my friends, General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker, and my OPA, Samarsa. So I'm very delighted to see all of them. I will start with the last point that Alyssa mentioned, and that was about the education and the past 3 days. When the Afghan people, I have never seen that amount of tears and emotion among the Afghans when the school was banned again. And I think that was something that the whole nation is seeing, that why Afghanistan is against all the will of the whole world, whether it is Islamic world or the others. In the Afghan people, we are moving backward. So with that note, I think both Alyssa and General Petraeus has given a very good account and summary of what happened in Afghanistan from a different angles. But let me to start my presentation with focusing from a different perspective that I think many of the points that I wanted to mention, it was mentioned by them. I think one was the US military intelligence and security strategy toward Afghanistan. And the second is, which I will be focusing more, is the missed opportunities over all these years. I think one of the important issues that we noticed over all these years was that very frequently changing strategy approach or policy approach toward Afghanistan. It was not consistent. And with every political wind, it changed. And it was not sufficient time and resources that you can see the return on the investment. So that was really some of the biggest problem and challenge that we faced during all these years. So to give you a very brief points about the missed opportunities. I think in 2001, the first missed opportunity was the Bonn Agreement. And I think we didn't include it. It was not inclusive because we did not include those who were defeated in the Bonn discussion. If we had at that time Hizb Islami and Taliban engaged in those discussions, I think it was today we could have a different outcome. The second important missed opportunity was 2003.
No.
I think in 2003, the invasion of Iraq put Afghanistan in the shade. I think all the attention has been diverted to something else. And I think this will bring me to the initial 6-point policy agenda of the United States toward Afghanistan, which was saying that eliminate Al-Qaeda, compel or convince Taliban to cut ties with Al-Qaeda. It was also building an international coalition in fighting in Afghanistan. It was also mentioned in that policy approach that the US war in Afghanistan should not be seen as a war against the Afghan people or a war against Islam. Also to demonstrate the US resolve in war against the terrorism, no matter where it is. And also it was that how to stabilize Afghanistan. And these were the key policy points in relation to Afghanistan in the beginning. So then what happened? And I think in these in the first issue that eliminate Al-Qaeda, punish Taliban, I think building international coalition, and I think it was the first time that there was the region and international community in the beginning, they were all aligned behind the US strategy because there was a consensus on a stable Afghanistan. And I think that everybody was aligning behind it. But gradually we lost that alignment, we lost that consensus, and it was a different reason, and it was different as the war continued in Afghanistan. In between 2005 and 2009, I think what we didn't have was a lack of a meaningful political roadmap. Emphasis was more only on the military, because if you look to the slogans of that time, initial slogan was clear, kill, capture. And then it was changed to a different slogan, which General Petraeus mentioned very well about the counterinsurgency strategy, about clear, hold, and develop. Those were the kind of shifts. And then if you look into the strategy at that time as well, we started in 2010 and 2012. I think that was the time when there was surge, there was announcement for withdrawal, there was the covert talks, there was the discussion about the Doha office. But that was the time that what we missed. We were talking about reintegration, but we were not talking about reconciliation. I think that was the time where we could start from a position of strength rather than to start the talking from a position of weakness. Between 2013 and 2014, I think the same situation we faced in 2020. The withdrawal, the election, the huge wave of propaganda, the North Waziristan operation. And I think we have seen that at that time, more than 98,000 or 90,000 foreign forces was withdrawn from Afghanistan. There was the North Waziristan operation. The Afghan security forces were thinly distributed in the bases where those bases to be secured. The enabler was reduced, but at the same time, Afghanistan was facing with several kind of a transition. The many different terrorist groups who were having bases in the outside Afghanistan, in the tribal areas, they were pushed inside Afghanistan. I think that was also a missed opportunity from the Taliban side, because there was an announcement for withdrawal. There was a situation where for a genuine negotiation, the situation was more mature. That was the biggest mistake that the Taliban has made, and they have to be made accountable for that, because how many people have been killed after that time? 2014 and 2015, I think that was also a very difficult time, both for military and also for the Afghan people, because the propaganda has resulted in thousands of Afghans left Afghanistan. There was always the speculation that today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, the system will collapse and what will happen. And that strategic communication was actually having a very negative impact on the Afghanistan. Between 2019 and 2021, I call it the years of chaos in terms of policy and strategy and uncertainty, because maybe every 3 months, every 6 months, things were changing and policies were different, and you were not knowing that how you plan and how you will go. And that was the time when the talks started, when the Afghanistan government was sidelined from the direct talks between US and the Taliban, and the way and misleading of the Doha agreement, and the consequences of that was lead to the collapse. So the US started with the light footprint, then shifted to the heavy footprint, and then ended with no footprints. And I think that was then the collapse. So I think that will also shows the inconsistency and I think the many mistakes that has been made. What happened? Why the collapse? People are saying that the collapse happened when the president and the government, the Taliban entered Kabul and they left, and it is not that one day that the collapse happened. I think it is more deeper. It has to be more, the different aspects has to be, a thorough research has to be done about this, and to evaluate every different aspect, why we reached to that point and why we not succeeded. That will require a kind of an independent, impartial assessment and research about the past that we learned from those mistakes, because today, the environment of the emotion, the environment that the people are very disappointed, and we are all, I think from myself and many other Afghans, we blame ourselves, we blame each other, or international blame us, we blame them. I think that blame, well, we all have made mistake when we are all responsible for what happened in Afghanistan. And nobody can say that we are not responsible for the current, whether it is Taliban, whether it is the Afghan government, whether it is the United States, NATO, and even the regional countries. and particularly those who supported the violence in Afghanistan, they are more responsible for the chaos that we are seeing today in Afghanistan. I think what happened in Afghanistan, despite of all positive changes in the social, political, economic front as a result of the international community engagement, there were areas where things did not progress as it was supposed. Collapse was not an immediate single incident of a day. It was the result of a gradual accumulation of complex set of problems and challenges that has resulted to that. I think the day when Afghanistan was sidelined from the direct Doha talks, the legitimacy and the perception on the Afghan government has changed. And I think that was to the narrative that the Taliban and others were saying that this is a puppet government. It has no legitimacy. It has no kind of authority. So this is why the Taliban was always arguing that why they have to negotiate with the Afghan government. And this is why the sidelining of the Afghan government from the direct talks, as we were pushing all the time that it should be a three-party. The key parties to this conflict, the Afghan government, the US, and the Taliban has to be on the negotiating table. But anyway, that was something that was the beginning of the erosion of the authority of the government in Afghanistan. Throughout the years, we and our international partners were reactive in response to a gradual worsening security situation. We were not ahead of the time. We were just reacting to that. And we were ignorant because what was happening in the region and in the safe havens and the continuation of that. I think until the last day, we were knowing, but we were not saying that, yes, that who is behind and who is responsible. Today, when you compare the situation in Afghanistan and the situation in the Ukraine, you can see that if there is a strong resolve, how the world can be mobilized behind a just case. But in the case of Afghanistan, I think that was always a kind of a point of ignorance. And that is one of the reasons why this war continued and year by year, the worsening situation happened, despite of all the other mistakes that Alyssa has mentioned, that the violence, the chasing the individual, the civilian casualties, and all these issues. Dependency and differences undermine the legitimacy in the eye of the people, because we were very much, our military was very much dependent on the US support, whether it is enabler, whether it is support, whether it is the contacting, and that dependency prevented the security forces to be able to act independently and at the same time to take the lead. Although on the paper we took the lead, but in fact, that was not the lead. Division among the Afghan political elite combined with the continuation of violence created space for corruption. And I think that was the two very strong elements, which was the large contracting industry and the tracking and supply. And the second was the drug. I think these two elements has poured a huge amount of money into a system that is becoming the pandemic of the corruption has eroded the trust of the people at the same time with at the different level. I think the right decision was made at the wrong time. I think that was another important issue. We were making the decision at the time when the crisis was reaching to its peak, and it was very difficult to reverse it. For instance, between 2002 and 2005, I think the cost of reconciliation could have been much, much lower than what we faced in the later stages. Because at that time, we were saying that we will not talk with Taliban. We wanted to take the revenge. But at the later stage, when we wanted to talk, it was gradually we are lowering our position, and they were becoming more bolder. And as a result, we were not achieving what we wanted to achieve. I think the withdrawal without reaching a political settlement, I think that was another big blow that was happening, because initially it was saying that there was a conditional based, and then the conditional based was there was changes in the messaging, and all these differences in the messaging and the way the Doha Agreement was implemented. Even it's when initially the whole text of the agreement and then its implementation, I think it didn't achieve what it was intended. For instance, there was 4 interconnected issues, and always it was mentioned that yes, there is that cutting ties with Al-Qaeda. There was intra-Afghan negotiation to reach a political settlement. There was the issue of withdrawal, and at the same time, there was the support for the future of Afghanistan. I think only one thing, which was the full withdrawal of the international forces from Afghanistan, that was implemented, but the rest, I think it was very fragile, and instead of in different stages, there was assurance that there will be no attack on the provincial capital. There will be no attack on the district centers. But we have seen that how gradually, when the talks would delay, and the delays in the talks was happening because of the different reasons. Every time there was a review, and every review took time. And during the implementation of the Doha Agreement, I think we faced with those reviews, and there was pauses in the discussion, and the Taliban was waiting for this moment. Once it was announced that it is unconditional withdrawal, I think the Taliban and the others who were supporting the Taliban was positioning themselves in a way that they pushed for the military, and when they reached to the doors of the Kabul, I think that was where everything was collapsed. I think the election, the last election, that was too divisive. I think for the first time we have seen that 2 presidents was inaugurated at the same day. And I think that was a biggest political mistake that happened. Another very important point was that even the right decision were badly communicated and decided when it was decided in the wrong time, then it was communicated in a very bad way. Confused and demoralized security forces wide limited their ability due to the dependency on external enabler and logistic with immediate impact. And I think as soon as the withdrawal has started, and the contractor also has to leave, because they were very much dependent on the security provided by the US forces. I think poor leadership and miscalculations, and I think sometimes there was a very rosy picture was provided to the leadership for the decision making, and I think sometimes we were misleading ourselves that yes, today or tomorrow or the next day things will be improved or this policy will be changed, and I think this miscalculation has prevented that. Some key decision has to be made and leadership to be provided to the people of Afghanistan to be mobilized behind a solid and strong efforts to defend the country. Military collapse was in the first place the result of political failure. It was not purely the military failure. The Afghan government, the US, NATO, and the Taliban and their direct supporters were all part of this failure and responsible for the new phase of the humanitarian and political crisis in the country and beyond. The big power and smaller spoilers in the region were waiting for this moment to gear up their geopolitical agendas, locked for several years due to the presence of international forces in Afghanistan. And I think that was also a reason of what happened. In the current crisis, we are facing now with the worst humanitarian situation. Around 23 to 24 million people face starvation. Another cycle of significant brain drain of young and educated, talented young Afghans are happening. Sense of insecurity and trust put people in endless cycle of intimidation, lack of capacity for functional administration to deliver services. There is no that kind of a capacity. Many terrorist groups inspired in city new space for their operation, and I think that is something that has to be watched and happen. The Ukraine crisis put Afghanistan in the sideline. Visible signs that the same mistake of the 90s are once again repeating with the US if US turns its back to Afghanistan. Humanitarian aid alone cannot solve the problem in Afghanistan at this point. What are the issues that need attention? I think the international approach toward Afghanistan is fragile. There is no clear policy beyond humanitarian aid. Taliban were not able to offer a political roadmap for meaningful reconciliation at the national level. A simple framework that helped the attraction of foreign direct investment and support the private sector, I think that is lacking. There is not available. There is no clear definition for an inclusive national Islamic government concept. Everybody is talking about that, but what does that mean? We are still fighting the past instead of working to build the future. For the mistake of the top leaders, Republican Taliban, and also our international partners, the Afghan people should not be punished. I think what I will not repeat because many of the good points that were mentioned before by the two speakers, and I think what is needed to move forward. I think one of the important issues, no matter how we lobby for the human rights, for the rights of women, the rights of girls, the right for education, for work, unless we focus on some of the following. The first important issue is Afghanistan is suffering from the geopolitical rivalries. Afghanistan has seen in the past half a century several regime change, and behind every regime change, there was a foreign element that was pushing for that regime change. And every regime change has brought more suffering to Afghanistan rather than to help Afghanistan to move into the right direction. And this is one of the most important issues that regional countries and big power must stop seeing Afghanistan from their lens of geopolitical rivalries. It will not serve their interests, but will help increase the risk of insecurity beyond Afghanistan. Second, beyond immediate humanitarian aid is important, but without functional administration in formulating a simple policy framework for attracting investment and supporting private investment, it will be difficult to overcome current humanitarian crisis or step into a path of sustainable improvement. Instead of parallel aid administration and inclusive functional administration will be important, because if you don't have the rule of law, if you don't have the constitution, if you don't have a clear path for a political system where the right of people are enshrined in the constitution, or the constitution order is reestablished, I don't think whatever lobbying is doing, whatever pressure we are putting, I think we will not be able to move into a situation where every day there will be a change of policy, there will be people changing, there will be instruction is coming, there will be new order will be coming. So I think we have seen this in the first round of the Taliban rule in Afghanistan, and I think the same thing is repeated once again. A political roadmap, a political system that is supported by all Afghans, not imposed from outside, will not be subject to frequent regime changes and should be enshrined in the Constitution, where the rights of all, including women, should be granted. As a sovereign country, Afghanistan must be in charge of its destiny, but by gaining its legitimacy from its own people through their vote in a national dialogue. As a first step toward this and completing the incomplete chapter of peace and reconciliation that result in a trusted, functional, inclusive government. Another vicious circle of violence should be prevented, but it will depend on the current rulers not to repeat the past mistake. Because this is a very important issue, because how many more years we have to spend in the bloodshedding. Avoiding the risk of re-emergence of terrorist groups, inspired and try to organize themselves with a new narrative such as a Daesh. Those supported these groups are experiencing the same backfire. And I think we have talked these days, there is a lot of discussion about the reactivation of the TTP or Daesh or other groups. It means those who are supporting these groups, I think they will see the backfire and they will see the consequences. And I think Pakistan should learn from their policy of strategic depths in Afghanistan, and I think that will not serve their interests. They will not serve the interests of anyone. So I think it will require a more engaged policy in the region and also international community, as I don't see any of that kind of a clarity. Regional and international support. Currently, there is no clear policy, neither at the regional level, nor at the international and US level, on how to deal with the situation in Afghanistan beyond humanitarian aid, unless they support a political roadmap that brings back Afghanistan as a respected member of the international community. Afghanistan will fall back to another cycle of long-term violence that must be avoided. And another point that I want to mention, that stop turning your back. With many excuses that could be made, it will be more dangerous and to repeat the past mistake. And we have to avoid that. And the US and the international community should engage with Afghanistan and Afghan people. I think this is important for Afghanistan and also for the world. I will conclude my remarks with Afghanistan faced with the legacy of several regime changes over the past 45 years, and each of these had direct impact on social, political, and economic life of Afghans. This caused further division and allowed foreign powers for overt or covert meddling. Foreign intervention in all these years was a dynamic force for regime change. This has to stop, and there is no military solution for the crisis in Afghanistan, for the repeated crisis in Afghanistan. The lesson learned at the cost of blood and treasure suggests past mistakes should not be repeated, and any ruling power who undermine this lesson will not be able to survive and not last for long in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you, General Petraeus. Thank you, Excellencies. Staniksai, sorry, I keep turning around. That's where I can see you. I will just ask one question of each and then move to the very excellent questions from people in the audience. And I think after this period, we'll maybe all just stand up and stretch so that we are refreshed for the next speakers. So I wanted to ask a question, General Petraeus, taking off from your point, your very interesting point, that you felt that in many ways, the US did not get the resourcing right for much of its time in Afghanistan. And you were involved in the reassessment around 2008, 2009, and the readjustments. I wondered, in that period, if I remember right, all of the options were basically for increases, sometimes significant increases in numbers of troops and effort overall. And I just wondered if there had been any consideration given to the kind of lighter footprint that might have resulted in a lower profile for the US and hence both fewer casualties for our own soldiers and people in the field, but also lower costs that might have been sustainable over the much longer period, because I think your point that this should have been much more of a generational commitment is really important. And the very size of the amount of money that was being spent made it difficult. Did you consider a smaller approach? And if not, why not? Did it seem, what was your thinking about it?
Well, it's a great question, Alyssa. And the short answer is that we did not. The reason that we did not is because we had several missions assigned to us. They were first and foremost always the overriding mission, of course, was to ensure that Al-Qaeda cannot reestablish a sanctuary in Afghanistan, something they had repeatedly tried to do. Second implied mission was provide a platform from which we can conduct the regional counterterrorism campaign, the most visible manifestation of which was ultimately actually in the final months that I was the commander of the operation from Afghanistan to Abbottabad, Pakistan, in which Osama bin Laden was brought to justice. But beyond those two, it was imperative that we halt the momentum of the Taliban. The Taliban were on the march. We had squandered that early period, as the minister mentioned. We didn't take advantage, as you mentioned, we did not take advantage of the early years of very, very low violence to really build the Afghan forces and institutions. So we didn't have, it literally was not an option to not have larger US forces, because we could not sufficiently enable the Afghan forces that were still very inadequate at that point in time. We had to halt the momentum of the Taliban again. We actually had to roll it back in very key areas. And those key areas included, as the minister and Ambassador Crocker will remember, in particular, Kandahar, because it was encroaching on Route 1, also Helmand, the same thing. And of course, this is where the hotbed of the Taliban and the wellspring of the movement was. Then there were also other objectives in the eastern part of the country and southeast and so forth. Again, it was an overall countrywide campaign, but the priorities were those that I just established. We had to do that, or else the effort was literally doomed, because again, the Taliban were just gobbling up territory and putting the entire effort at risk. Without security, that's the foundation, as you well know. Without security, you can't do any of the other great stuff that we wanted to do. It's only with security that you can do that. And then ideally, you do it in a way that actually solidifies the security foundation by restoring basic services, enabling the reestablishment of local governance and local grievance mechanisms, rebuilding schools, markets, roads, infrastructure, and on, that you actually do that. So that was the challenge. And then beyond that, we had, again, missions that required the additional space and time, which were to accelerate the development of the Afghan security forces, and to also accelerate the development of the critical Afghan institutions as we developed the transition concept, the standards, the ideas, the approaches, and then actually did, as the final of one of the missions was actually begin the process of transitioning some security tasks and some other tasks to critical ministry elements in select districts and provinces. With respect to, not just because I was the commander and then Ambassador Crocker was later the ambassador, we actually did accomplish those missions. Now, we made mistakes along the way, as I said, without question, in part because we knew that this opportunity was fleeting. the ideal situation would have been that we committed those resources. We didn't announce at the same time that we announced the buildup that we were going to draw down on a date certain, regardless of the conditions. That clearly was a domestic U.S. imperative, not a domestic U.S. political rationale, not one tied to Afghanistan. And it undermined what we were doing in Afghanistan. Because again, it told the enemy that, yeah, we're going to build up for a while, but just hang tough and we'll start drawing down in July of 2011. And so that was this challenge, and it sort of wrapped up in the overall issue that I identified as the really big challenge for Afghanistan, was that we just never could seem to get the commitment right. And then in a sense, keep it right. Not that that commitment always needed to be massive. At the end, it didn't need to be massive. It just needed to be 3,500 troops with a lot of drones and the coalition forces and 15,000 or more contractors, because by then you actually had the Afghan forces and, Afghan institutions that, again, however frustratingly challenging they were, the forces in particular had fought very, very valiantly. I stressed in my remarks that they gave their lives at a rate that was 26 times the loss of Americans in our 20 years in Afghanistan. And they were willing to continue the fight if there had been continued support, in a sense that, again, there was a reason to continue their fighting and that people were coming to the rescue. So again, it just was not an option. I mean, there was no way. We did a review, as you may recall. It was called the McChrystal Review when General McChrystal took over in the late spring, I guess it was, of 2009. He had 60 days or 90 days to do the review. I remember receiving that review. And again, the situation was dire. And there was just no way to accomplish the missions that we'd been assigned by the administration without fairly considerable additional forces. Again, at that point, it was 30,000 additional, which interestingly was only about what we put into the surge in Iraq in the end. And we built on the surge in Iraq from a point of 130,000 American, or 135,000 Americans in Iraq, rather than a 70,000 or so that we had in Afghanistan when we conducted that surge.
Well, thank you. I guess one of the problems is always that higher levels of expenditure are harder to sustain domestically in the US. Yeah. And so then you're caught in a bind where you're forced to then downsize probably before you're ready. And then the entire.
Well, again, with respect, I don't know that it was not sustainable. I mean, it was really much more of an American political imperative. I mean, I was never explained why we couldn't sustain it, actually. Again, the imperative of drawing down in July of 2009 was something that was merely added at the 11th hour. We were told about it 2 days before the speech was given. In the Oval Office on a Sunday evening, and a big surprise. It had never been discussed during the process at all. The assumption had been that there would be a conditions-based process. We did make the transition process conditions-based, at least as long as Ambassador Crocker and I were there. But over time, again, that eroded as well. The irony is, though, that at the end, despite all the erosion and the challenges and everything else, there actually was a commitment that could have been sustained and would have been sustainable, in my view, in terms of the expenditure of admittedly American blood and treasure. But again, 3,500 US troops and $25 billion or whatever was very sustainable, and certainly compared to what it was that we had to commit during that period when the Taliban were really encroaching on the most critical infrastructure in the country in 2009. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Your Excellency, Mr. Sangsai, I think one question, and I'm hoping others will raise this as well, really, there are two here. The first is you made the point about Bonn, that that at the Bonn Agreement, which for those of you who may not remember it, there were meetings in Bonn, Germany, just after the Taliban were ousted by the US and coalition in 2001 to figure out what an interim government would look like until proper elections could be organized and held with the UN. And one of the notable points was that the Taliban were not there, nor was anyone who represented them, was close to the Taliban, or no one of significance. So the voice of the defeated was not at the table. And typically in peace negotiations, the side that's been defeated also has to be party to the agreement. And some people, I'm not really stating my opinion because I don't really have so much of view, but I know there's a very heated argument about whether things could have been different had the Taliban been at the table and it had been negotiated early on in a way that did not make inevitable a regrouping and then another civil war, essentially. And I wondered if you could shed some light on why that didn't happen and whether you think it was possible given the level of animosity that existed between the groups who were at the table, because the people who were there adamantly did not want or believe the Taliban had a right to be there. So it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very good question. Yes, there was emotion was very high. The animosity was also very deep. But at the same time, it was not impossible. It could have taken some more time. And even if it was not possible in the short period of the Bonn Agreement when they could be involved because they were defeated, they were on the run. But between 2002 and 2005, that was the period where they could have been engaged in a very meaningful way. But at that time, the military strategy was, in fact, if you look over the different period, there was always some kind of a differences behind the scene of the position of the military intelligence and the State Department. And I think that was also something that made the problem. Although in 2005, Professor Mujahidi was assigned for a reconciliation, but in fact, it was not a reconciliation. It was just reaching out to individual to surrender. It was not a meaningful political dialogue that could have been resulted into a political kind of engaging them in a true way. But more emphasis was on the military, as I mentioned, that there was the slogan of kill, capture strategy, and that was what happened in Afghanistan at that time. As I mentioned, that we all make the mistakes in Afghanistan. In each time, when anyone who came to the power, they want to use the monopoly of the power and not to share with others. And that was the repeated mistake that happened in Afghanistan repeatedly. And I think today the Taliban is making that mistake once again. If the people who are now out of the political system, if they are not engaged, one day the Taliban will regret that. And we don't want that Afghanistan to go and move into another cycle of violence.
Say in my space. Okay, well, thank you. And now I'm just going to raise some of the wonderful questions from the audience. There is one here, please forgive me if I mispronounce your name, to General Petraeus, from Stephen Amendola. And the question is, why was the problem of the Taliban never opposed or confronted at its source in Pakistan, and with the with the ISI, with the Inter-Services Intelligence, why did we continue to furnish the ISI with money and weapons even after we knew that it was helping the Taliban, who in turn were killing and American soldiers? And what was the reasoning behind not going after the Taliban sort of sources in Pakistan? And this is probably a question that Ambassador Crocker might have thoughts on too.
I was going to offer that since he was the ambassador at one point in time, although not in the really critical point in time, which is when, again, we had this increase in forces. And it was a period where we were going to make progress against the Taliban on the battlefield in Afghanistan, first when I was a Central Command commander, then as commander on the ground in Afghanistan, and then indeed as the CI director. And I mean, the principal reasons that we ultimately never could really just bring the real pressure to bear, although money was withheld at various times, there were other penalties plus also inducements, was that we were dependent on Pakistan for the two routes into Afghanistan. We did establish a northern distribution network, as it was called, a route that went out from the north. In fact, it was done when I was the Central Command commander, and I had to go see the longtime Uzbek president at that point in time and convince him to allow us to do that, which took a lengthy conversation, but we got it done. But it could not substitute for the two routes that came in to Pakistan from the east through the Khyber Pass and then from the south up into Kandahar. Those were critical. We would typically ship our major end items, the really large equipment items, over. They'd go into the port of Karachi, and then they would take one of those two routes again through the Khyber Pass or into the south. And they were irreplaceable. And we knew that if they were ever shut off, and they were shut off, by the way, for a period of almost 40 days, actually when Ambassador Crocker was the ambassador, as I recall, when General Allen took over from me after a particularly bad incident in which Americans killed Pakistanis who we believed came to cross the border wrongly and posed a threat. And it almost brought the effort to its knees. We flew everything in on C-17s for a long period of time, incredibly costly, and again, very limiting. So that's the really big issue. Beyond that, I would point out that there was this hope, actually, especially with the Obama administration and with Ambassador Richard Holbrooke as the AFPAC representative of the President and Secretary of State, that all of a sudden Pakistan was going to work with us. He and Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I invested an enormous amount in the relationship with General Kiani, who arguably was the most important man in Pakistan. As the chief of army staff, certainly we had a relationship with President Zardari, who was the chief executive at the time as well. But it really was, again, our relationship was with General Kiani, the Director General of ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence Organization. By the way, we never funded the ISI that I can recall, and Ambassador Crocker, I think, will affirm that. We did provide very substantial amounts of money, certainly to the Pakistani army in a variety of different pools that probably added up to, and then also Ambassador Holbrooke and I got 1.5 billion additional dollars a year for economic assistance for Pakistan, because we thought they were actually on the right track. And in 2009, they began a campaign focused on the Pakistani Taliban that was ultimately going to culminate with an effort against the major sanctuaries of the Haqqani network, Al-Qaeda, and others in North Waziristan. And it was quite admirable. And it worked out through the entire year. We were even providing drone support. Special operations forces were in their brigade headquarters. And it just ran out of steam. It culminated before it closed on North Waziristan sufficiently, and that pocket was left. And again, we were strung along for a period of time. And frankly, it took us a period to realize that this was not going to happen. There was There's one well-known public operation that was conducted against the Taliban in Baluchistan, which is, of course, where their sanctuary was in southwestern Pakistan, which killed the then leader of the Taliban after its founder. But that was the extent of what was ever done there. There was never a willingness in the United States government to allow more than what was done, for fear, again, that this would jeopardize those critical routes in and out of Afghanistan. It was a massive, massive frustration for us. It was an even bigger frustration for the Afghan government. Again, as I mentioned, at points in time, the money was withheld. It was, there were all kinds of diplomatic initiatives to try to get them to do more about that. But at the end of the day, it was not forthcoming. And again, typically after all the pros and cons were weighed, there was not sufficient support in Washington in particular to do more than was allowed. And I should also note that it's publicly known, the New York Times reported it frequently, that there were, of course, operations conducted into North Waziristan. That was the one area in which they were conducted, typically against Al-Qaeda, and also on occasion elements of the Haqqani network, but not the kind of operations, again, that one would have liked to have seen, and certainly never anything on the ground other than one time where the blowback was so substantial that it was never done again. That took place before I was on the ground in Afghanistan. But Ryan, I'd welcome your intervention here in addition or difference with any of that.
Go ahead.
So, yeah, in the interest of time and cohesion, I will address that, but not right now.
Okay.
I wanted to ask a question of both of you, that because it really, you both raised this. This is from Emma McAllister, who's a William and Mary law student. She said both of you have mentioned the continued threat of potentially ungoverned space in Afghanistan that poses to the West as a place where Islamic extremist groups could regroup. How do you see that threat evolving, and in what way does that affect the region as a whole? What kind of opportunities do they have given the economic and political influence nearby of China and Russia? Will they foresee them using Afghanistan again? Do you see any inhibition coming from, obviously China has been very wary of Islamic extremism as well. Russia right now, as we know, is pretty much occupied elsewhere. But what do you see as the future for Afghanistan being used again by extremist groups?
Maybe I can start and then I'll hand off to the minister. I see this as a significant threat. The reality is that there's something about Afghanistan that exerts a huge magnetic attraction over Islamist extremists. And perhaps the minister can explain this better than I, because I went out to Eastern Afghanistan, to the Tora Bora area and the other areas where the Al-Qaeda had their sanctuary, in which the 9/11 attacks were planned and so forth. And it escaped me, but I think there is something about the nature of that area, the people who live there, the culture there, the receptivity to them, the remoteness of it, but also still some access actually back through the Khyber Pass to Peshawar Airport and so forth, that it's just a very attractive place. And they have repeatedly tried to come back to Eastern Afghanistan, including when I was privileged to be the commander there and when I was the director of the CIA. And we periodically had to conduct operations against them. I should also note, there was a period where they had a very substantial sanctuary in southern Helmand province, of all places, down in the south, that minister will recall. That's many years later, which we ultimately destroyed in a pretty substantial operation. I should also note that the Islamic State, of course, gravitated out there, and there's the Islamic State Khorasan group now, which essentially operates in both Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Once again, it's roughly in that same area. One of the terrible side effects of the Afghan liberation of all the prisons in Afghanistan en route to Kabul was that about 1,000 of ISIS members were allowed out. They immediately reinforced ISIS, so it's never been stronger than it is. I should note now it's fighting the Taliban, though. It is a more violent and more vicious and more barbaric organization even than is Al-Qaeda. So again, I think this is a real threat. I don't know how long it would take to, I mean, the conditions will determine whether it can become once again a regional and even more global threat. That's very difficult from there, but by no means obviously impossible, since that was again where the 9/11 attacks were planned and the initial training of the attackers was conducted, albeit at a time before we made many improvements to the intelligence and law enforcement sharing in our country that would prevent the kind of stovepiping that prevented connecting the dots that would have allowed us to discover the 9/11 attacks. So I think we are going to have to keep a very close eye on it. It's much more difficult because we not only don't have a base in Afghanistan anymore, we don't have a base anywhere in Central Asia whatsoever, nor in Pakistan. And it takes a long time if you're going to fly a drone all the way out there and back from a base in the Gulf states to try to provide the kind of continuous unblinking eye that we had over many parts of the country, which over time you could gradually begin to understand what was going on. And keep in mind that without the supplement of human intelligence sources, intelligence operatives, contact with locals and so forth, when you look through that soda straw that is the optic of a drone, it's not always very, very clear what's going on down below you and who the guys with guns may or may not be and so forth and so on. But with that, Minister, I hand off to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think if we look to the situation in Afghanistan, we have gone through the different cycle of radicalization. We wanted to solve one problem, but with a policy, then we created a new problem. When in the jihad against the Soviet Union, I think the Mujahideen has fought, and that was the first round of radicalization started at that time. And at the end of that, we were witness of the emergence of Al-Qaeda, and then followed with Taliban when the civil war started, and the Taliban emerged at the next level of radical element in order to be justified their narrative against what the Mujahideen was doing. And then in the ashes of the war on terror, I think Daesh has emerged. And in order for the Daesh to have their narrative, to have the supremacy in terms of the extreme ideology, they have moved into the next level of the extreme, and they have adopted the policy or the policy of the takfiris. So I think that was more radical, more brutal. And when you look to the region, to come directly to the question, and you can see today Afghanistan is a geopolitical location. It is important. It is an important location in the region. It is connecting all these different countries. We are neighboring with nearly several nuclear powers in this region. And then you can see also in terms of the different extremist groups operating in this region. China has their concern about the ETIM. Uzbekistan has about the concern about the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. Tajikistan has the same kind of a concern of the Nasser and Jindullah and other groups. And that is even spread differently, but all these different networks has a kind of a connection They have the differences, but they have the connections. But more importantly, all these different groups are in one time or another time are used as an element of their national security for some countries against the other countries. And I think there is a lot of suspicions and mistrust in the region about who is supporting who. And for that reason, when I suggested that Afghanistan should not be seen from the geopolitical lens of the geopolitical rivalries, that is true. Afghanistan, I think you can see the differences between India and Pakistan. You can see the differences between China and United States. You can see the current situation of the Russia with the Ukraine crisis, the Central Asia, Iran, and all the neighboring countries. In Pakistan, the game that has been played over all these years, and I think they are now suffer from what they have developed. So I think you can see that the threat will not disappear immediately, and I think that will still pose the threat that could be used by one or another. There will be a new kind of a coalition or partnership will be developed among the different groups based on the development of situation in the big games which is ongoing in the region and beyond.
Well, thank you so much. I think maybe we'll just stand up for 30 seconds, stretch in place, and then, as Christy says, and then we'll go. Thank you.
Good idea. Getting out of these chairs. Never easy.
It's better for us to go for half an hour.
Okay.
Okay, we have and 3:30 in the paper. With Central Territory.
Okay, well, then it's gonna be on one condition. Do you have anybody?
Yeah, it's too bad that. Yeah. Oh, I hope.
Yeah, black, no cream, no sugar. Black coffee?
Black coffee, I don't know what sign this even is.
You mean it's the cafe?
Yeah.
Just share my Michigan cold. That's what I brought.
Thank you, Mike.
Jump out of here.
Yeah.
Can you take care of that?
It's way too much.
Oh.
Good idea.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Because I feel.
Teaching.
Yeah.
So they're all there. Just.
I'm scared.
Yeah, and there's gonna be.
No, I'm terrified. It's Afghanistan.
You wouldn't have had that experience, I think, when you were enough younger.
Yes, I do.
I got to, and I remember as a first grader, under my desk, thinking,
No. Exactly.
but it was kind of back, it was there, the shadow of it.
So, okay, you want to do Dr. Smart next?
Then I'll introduce her and then Ryan, then another Q&A.
Okay.
And then
You
you
have like,
oh, sure.
I know. I think.
Are we allowed to ask a question if you raise the hand?
Yes.
Because I keep seeing your eyes it's down. I'm like, when you're gonna look to us?
Oh,
Yes.
sorry.
So we should.
Sitting in the chair.
Hillary, we just gave a suggestion for how to use them, but I think especially after seeing this presentation, it will be important. Take call on people for sure.
Absolutely.
I think all probably go less than 30 now and then add it on to my
That's
summation.
fine.
Topics.
I'm going to introduce you. You're next. And
Administrative law, federal civil.
then we go into another Q&A.
I know, we can make that from the.
Step up for international.
Or
Yeah.
punch it up and then join our-
And
go to.
okay. Well. I said to Marie. Okay, so if, I'm going to introduce. Great. Okay, we're going to move into the second half of the program, or the second third of the program, and I'm just going to quickly introduce our next two speakers. And after they finish, we will go into another 30-minute period of Q&A, and I think we're going to be trying to take questions from the floor during the next session. So raise your hands, and Alyssa will moderate. So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Seema Samar. As you heard earlier, she is a medical doctor. She is a long-term human rights advocate, activist, and social worker, as well as being a medical doctor who received her medicine degree from Kabul University in national and international forums. From 2001 to 2003, she served as the first Minister of Women's Affairs in Afghanistan in the post-Taliban government. She has founded a number of schools and clinics for women in Afghanistan, and she kept them open during the most repressive days of the Taliban regime. She was ultimately forced into exile because of her activism and threats to her family. And after living as a refugee for over a decade, she returned to Afghanistan in 2002 to assume a cabinet post in the transitional administration led by Hamid Karzai. In the interim government, she served as deputy president as well as Minister for Women's Affairs. She's currently the head of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, and between 2005 and 2009, she served as UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Sudan. In 2019, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed her one of 8 members of the high-level panel on internal displacement. She is the recipient of the Right Livelihood Award for longstanding and courageous dedication to human rights, especially the rights of women in one of the most complex and dangerous regions of the world. We're very, very honored to have you here, Dr. Samar. And I want to introduce once again one of the heart and souls of this entire program. It would not have happened without Ambassador Ryan Crocker. He is now non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but he was a career Foreign Service officer, served 6 times as US ambassador in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. In addition to those ambassadorships, he has had assignments in Iran, Qatar, Iraq, and Egypt, as well as in Washington, D.C. He was assigned to the American Embassy in Beirut during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the bombings of the embassy and Marine barracks in 1983. His ambassadorships have been served under both Republican and Democrat administrations, and he previously served as the International Affairs Advisor at the National War College. He also has a very stellar academic career. Again, it's like his awards, it would take me the rest of the afternoon, but he has taught at Princeton, Yale, UVA, and served as the Dean of the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M. He has received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the inaugural Bancroft Award presented by the Naval Academy, named an honorary fellow of the Literary and Historical Society at the University of College in Dublin, where he was presented with an annual James Joyce Award. He has received a number of awards from our government, distinguished awards, and he has been named an honorary Marine. And one of my favorite, I hope it's okay that I say this, facts about him that I just recently found out during one of our meetings is he's a motorcycle rider. And his current ride is a 1963 BMW motorcycle, single seat, leather, classic and original. We are so honored to have you back here at William and Mary, Ambassador. Thank you.
It's a 64, not a 64.
Good afternoon to everyone, and it's my pleasure to be such a distinguished panel with Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus and Minister Sonakzai, and glad to see my other sisters from Afghanistan here, and particularly Humaira, that we were doing some work together on promotion of women's rights in the country. Just to make some correction, that I was only Minister of Women's Affairs for 6 months on the interim administration from late 2001 until July 2002. And I am not the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission currently. I was done in 2019. I would start that the case in Afghanistan, or Afghanistan case, is quite complex. It requires weeks and months to talk about it. And thank you for organizing this, but I would suggest that it should be longer program rather than 3-hour or 4-hour discussion on Afghanistan, because it's really important to learn from the mistakes in Afghanistan. And we should not repeat it. And unfortunately, we as a people in Afghanistan, we see the reputation of the history in our country. And also, I would say that I deeply feel that the pain of the people in Ukraine, because that's also, I think, it's a reputation of a history in the world, not in Afghanistan, but the reputation of the history of Afghanistan. Once again, another part of the world. What have been said already, they covered a lot, but from different angle, I will add some on the historic background of Afghanistan. The invasion of the USSR, then of course that was Cold War time, and I think most of the young students do not remember. You have to look on that issue and read it more, because it was really important. It's true that we should not be always stuck with the history, but if we do not see the past, we will not be able to build a better future or more constructive future for ourselves. What was wrong with the US policy, that it was short-term, short-sighted policy, I would say. They choose the most conservative group of people and start supporting them. And that was, as Minister Sonakzai said, that was the beginning of the radicalization in Afghanistan. The second point that was really a mistake, the ignoring of education and formal education in Afghanistan. So nobody really paid attention to quality education. Instead, they really promoted the madrasa, religious school style of education to fight against communism. But then communism, or at least USSR, is gone, but we suffer from that backlash. The third point that I would think was really had a long-term negative impact on the situation in Afghanistan, the ignoring of women's rights in the country. We're ignoring equality in general, because it was only a group of conservative people who were trained, supported, equipped to fight against the communism, rather than looking at the Afghan society in general and the role of women, because women were not existing for a long period of time, and that's why we have the Taliban. I insist on the ignoring of education, how that we really ignored education for men and women in the country, or for boys and girls in the country. Instead, we tried to establish these madrasas. And those children, I was refugee in Pakistan for 17 years. I saw myself when the children were taken from their family and trained,
brainwashed in those isolated environment. They never saw their mothers. They never saw the love of the family or the love of a woman. That's why they are so hatred. I mean, they think the women are the problem or the main enemy of them. It's true that we are the main enemy because we do not want their complete domination, but they see it differently. The second point that I would like to mention is that, again, on Geneva Accord, which was in 1988, and it was signed between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan signed on behalf of the Mujahideen, on behalf of the opposition on that time. US and Russia was witness of that accord. And no woman was involved, no people was involved in that accord. And the whole thing was the withdrawal of the Russian from the Afghanistan, and then consequently the collapse of the USSR and the collapse of Afghan regime. And then we had the Mujahideen government, which was completely ignorant of women's rights. And they started their own fighting in order to hold the power. And the US abandoned Afghanistan. They left, even most of the NGOs who were providing humanitarian services were stopped their work. So what's ended up, Afghanistan had the internal war, domestic war between ourselves and Afghanistan. Again, of course, it started earlier, the production of opium, but it's were increased more during that time. And there was a lot of division between the different ethnic groups in the country, because each one wanted to hold power for themselves, not willing to share with others. And the women, again, continued to be ignored, and they didn't have any role. And because of the anarchism during the Mujahideen, I think the Taliban were welcomed somehow in the country. Because, for example, I traveled in 1993 in Kabul, and I saw how different part of the city was controlled by different group of people, different ethnic group. From one part of the city, I had to take 2 taxis in order to reach to another part of the taxi. 2 taxis from different ethnic group. So that was unfortunately the case. And Taliban came in power, and then they started in Kandahar in 1994, and then finally they took power in 1996 in Kabul, and in 1998 almost the majority of most part of the country was taken by them. And the violation of human rights by Taliban was completely ignored. And nobody was listening. And as soon as they took over, the war against women started. And when I was lobbying, I mean, my fellow Afghans are quite young, but I was older than them and lobbying during the first Taliban regime. They were saying, it's your culture. It's not our culture. As Liza said, I had gone to co-education school 50 some years ago in Helmand, which is quite conservative part of the country. Women were, I mean, the war of Taliban was against women, no education. That was the only official or government officially banned on women's education, on girls' education and women's work outside of the house. Women were only allowed to work on the health sector, and a very limited, we didn't have a lot of women on that sector, unfortunately, but in very limited possibility of movement. Nothing was allowed. Afghanistan became a training camp of all the terrorist groups. I mean, before that, the environment was facilitated. But of course, during Taliban, it was more. And then Afghanistan became the biggest producer of Taliban, and the US here was trying to facilitate somehow the Unicol company to get the contract of the pipeline from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan. I was here in Washington when 120 Taliban member was brought here by Unicol company to be trained on pipeline. So Maliha Lodi, who's currently the Pakistan ambassador in UN, she was ambassador here in Washington. We were in a Women in Development conference when she said, I invited the Taliban tonight for dinner, would you join me? Because I'm the only woman. And I said, Maliha, you're the boss and I'm not the boss, so I don't want to join you. So 9/11 has happened. You could see on those people, either 24 or 19 people who were involved on that attack. Of course, it was exceptionally criminal, brutal attack on humanity, I would say, on people, on civilian. And none of them were Afghan. They might be trained in Afghanistan, but none of them were Afghan or had some connection with Afghanistan, but none of them were Afghan. In any case, it was an emergency case, so US interfered in Afghanistan, and the Afghan people really suffered a lot of casualties, a lot of bombing, a lot of terrified situation, and all those things. But I think what was really lacking was a long-term strategy. There were no long-term strategy after the Taliban was removed. To be very honest and frank, I'm not saying only to criticize. I'm saying this because we need to learn. We need to learn from the mistakes we done, all of us in Afghanistan, and not to repeat it again. And of course, we all know, we touched, all of us, somehow, that who was involved on supporting people like Taliban or neighboring countries. What we have done with the neighboring countries? Did we strongly discuss with them? Did we pressurize them? And it was always used as an excuse that they have the atomic bombs and it will fall at the hand of the fundamentalists. It's true, but there's no other way to deal. Why there's a sanction for all the other people, but not all on those people who were involved, strongly training people like Taliban or Al-Qaeda? Who was? I mean, Bin Laden was not found in Kabul, not found in a presidential palace or close to army post in Kabul, but he found in another country. And I would say that we are not in a situation to choose our neighbor. But we can live with our neighbor in a better way, in a better manner, in a better behavior. So that was, again, the issue. And the other point that I would say that, again, on the overall American policy in Afghanistan, quickly they said Afghanistan is a success story and they went to Iraq. Going to Iraq was really a big mistake. Not only for us as an Afghan, but generally, in general, why we should try to change the regime in another country instead of supporting the people to change their regime. And that is, I think, says a lot that why Afghanistan was failure again. And I put it in a way that Afghanistan is a collective failure. Failure of Afghan government, failure of Afghan people, including myself, and failure of the international community, particularly the failure of the United States, who was the leading country in most of the activities in Afghanistan. What was happened that, of course, as Minister Sanakzai said that Taliban was not put in the Bonn Agreement, we didn't have time to bring Taliban to the Bonn Agreement. That is the truth. That is the reality. It was the Taliban was removed from the power and different groups were trying to come in Kabul and take over the program, the power. in Kabul, so everybody was in rush to start that a roadmap for Afghanistan. And I think at least Bonn Agreement, in my personal view, was a roadmap for Afghanistan. If we were able to implement it properly and seriously, that would have been much better roadmap for Afghanistan solution in the past compared to the past other 23 years of the war. The good part with the Bonn Agreement, I think, was the establishment of the Ministry of Women's Affairs, not because I was put as a minister for 6 months, but something to acknowledge the existence of women and the importance of women. But of course, how much support has been given to Ministry of Women's Affairs? Not much. And how much women were involved on the policies in Afghanistan. Ambassador Crocker, remember, in fact, he was the first source of it when he gave me $9,000 for cleaning of Cinema Zainab when we had the first 8 March celebration in a burned cinema. And we didn't have the capacity to even to clean it up because it was burned during Taliban time. So it was full of everything almost, to clean up that one and have the celebration of 8 March in an open place. We didn't have a roof, but then Pakistani minister who brought a plastic or fabric roof for that cinema in order to have that. And also the establishment of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. It was first in our history that somebody acknowledged that human rights is important. I think the main mistake from my point of view, that during all these Cold War and after that, the ignoring of human rights and the importance of human rights and equality in Afghanistan. I believe that human rights is not Western value. It is a human value and it should be applied everywhere without reservation, without using the excuse of respecting the culture, respecting the religion, or even respecting the sovereignty of a country. Because if you do not respect human rights, if you do not, it means that we do not respect the rule of law. It means that we do not respect accountability, and we do not respect justice. So that was, I think, the main mistake in the country, and we have to admit that that was a big mistake, and we should not repeat it in another country. I think the other point that I would like to mention, the superficial policies in general. Yes, okay, we were talking about women's rights, but let's say when they were planning for different construction project in Afghanistan, nobody was involving women. I'll give you one example, that the main highway between Kabul and Kandahar was built with $800 million, Mr. Ambassador, I think you remember that. But in all these 600 kilometers, we don't count in miles, maybe 500 or 450 miles, something, approximately. And that $800 million, which was spent on that construction, it was given to American company, by the way. And then the American company subcontracted to some other companies, some other American company and Afghan companies, which was, of course, corruption was involved on it. But then in the whole highway, there's no single toilet built in order to facilitate a female passenger to use that toilet. So you can see how male-dominated policy was applied in Afghanistan and how patriarchy was supported, unfortunately. Not maybe intentionally, but unintentionally. And then we end up with the current bringing back Taliban after 20 years to power. The other point that I would like to mention, that we always try to use the blame game. There's no doubt it was, as I said, that it was a mistake of Afghan government. But did we sit together and honestly discuss the issue and divide the job among us? No, we didn't. I mean, with the small thing that I was running the Human Rights Commission, sometimes there was some advisor were saying that, well, it's a Western value, or do you think that the Western value will be applied in Afghanistan? And I was saying, excuse me, it's not Western value. It's a human value. Yes, it can be applied in Afghanistan, but we have to domesticate the whole issue in the country. And we achieved a lot with the international involvement on human rights and women's rights. But the sustainability was a big question mark. And how much money really gone to the empowerment of women in the country? Very little, including the last program, which was called Promote. It was $216 million for 5 years, but it's gone again to the American companies rather than to really empowerment. I hope Umaira is agree with me. Empowerment of women in the country. I think few points I would recommend. One, I think we have to acknowledge that we all make a mistake. And by acknowledging, we all have to work together in order to find a better solution for Afghanistan. And that is really important. We are speaking about peace process. We were talking about peace processes in Afghanistan, but it was not really inclusive. As Minister Sonakzai mentioned, that Mr. Murjadadi was given a kind of a what was it, Humaira? It was a strengthening peace. And then he was claiming that 10,000 Taliban laid down their guns, but the violence did not decrease in the country. So we didn't know who was that 10,000 Taliban and where that gun gone when they were collected from Taliban, where that was gone. Was it in the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Interior or Intelligence Service? And then it was the peace program in 2010. And then again, that High Peace Council was established. And they were saying that they encouraged more than 10,000 Taliban to come and reconcile. And a lot of money was spent on that. And again, the violence did not decrease in the country. So I think few clear recommendation. One, I think we need a long-term multi-dimensional strategy for Afghanistan with consistency. We didn't have consistency on the previous programs. Very simple things we didn't. I mean, one commander was coming and going, and then the same consistency was not there. He was not leaving notes for the other commander. With all the respect to the General Petraeus, I was one of the person fighting against the local police establishment in the country. And we had a report against the violation of human rights by the local police and promoting local militias or ethnic militias in Afghanistan. The second point I think I would like to say is that all of our approach, all of our policies should be based on principle of human rights. We should not deny the principle of human rights and equality in the country. Every person who lives in Afghanistan has the equal right, and no one is superior than the others. No man is superior than the woman, and no ethnic group is superior than the other ethnic group. Third point, I think. Again, we need really to promote the rule of law and accountability and justice. We all know how much war crimes and crimes against humanity has been done in Afghanistan. Do you know any other country who put official ban on education of girls? Because it's not mentioned on the definition of war crimes or crimes against humanity, that access to education is a sexual gender-based violence. And what is it? And why we are only trying to condemn by a statement. Because the ignoring access to education to half of the population, no development, no democracy, no sustainable peace will be possible in any country, not only in Afghanistan, but in any other country. That is not possible. The only strongest tool against ignorance would be the quality education and access to education for everybody. And the fourth point that I would like to mention is that we have to fight for inclusivity and fight against corruption. It's not enough that we condemn corruption. It's not enough that we mention something because of corruption. I was discussing with Ambassador Khalilzad why they are giving all the big contracts to some of the warlords in the country. And he was saying that we want the warlord to be busy with business rather than politics. But business and money has very close relation everywhere, including your country. So I think we have to look at that. And finally, I would say that the putting these people back to power, most of the fundamentalists around the world become more empowered. And patriarchy, more importantly, has gained more space and more place or space for maneuver. And patriarchy is always against equality, is always against the equal rights for different gender in any country. So the group who is fighting for empower or increasing the discrimination is of course the support to the patriarchy, support to inequality. Inequality and discrimination of human rights always is a reason for conflict. Is a reason for resistance. So I stop here and I'm happy to get any question. But I'm sorry that it's very difficult to talk after all the other people who are more professional on security and militarization rather than a human rights activist.
I think we'll turn now to Ambassador Crocker and then.
Well, I think I'll pick up pretty much where you left off. I'd like to start by saying what a privilege it is to have you here, Dr. Seema, and on the small screen or large screen in this case, Masoom Stanekzai. It's hard for us here as Americans to understand, I think, or appreciate what it takes and what it means to be an activist in a place like Afghanistan over the last 20 years. It's so fundamentally different from our own challenges and society. Every day you're in Afghanistan, you are a potential target. These aren't threats to have you brought before a congressional committee. These are threats to shoot you down. And in Masoom Stanekzai's case, he almost paid with his life in 2011 when suicide, yeah, exactly, well, which time, of course, because it was more than once. A suicide bomber directed his bomb at former President Rabbani and at Mr. Stanekzai, killing Rabbani and very badly injuring Zoom, who will bear those injuries for the rest of his life. So it is, again, a notion of courage and commitment. It's really hard for us to internalize. I just wanted to be able to say that because there are, out of Afghanistan came a lot of bad things, but boy, oh boy, some very good things too. And, you know, the kind of the role model for the world of what courage in the face of authoritarianism, terrorism, and patriarchy. So you mentioned the Kandahar to Kabul highway and its dearth of facilities for women, even though it was built by an American company. Well, I kind of would guess that would be par for the course. If any of you have been to a concert or a baseball game or a football game lately, how many lines do you see out in front of the men's room to get in? Like none, ever. How about the women's room? Yeah, around the block. Because of an interesting definition of equal facilities. So we have a lot of work to do in this country on gender equality. I would commend some reading to you, since I know you're starved for intellectual stimulation of this colleagues. The Hillary Doctrine. It's got a really jazzy subtitle, Sex and U.S. Foreign Policy. In the Hillary Doctrine, of course, was her statement at the Beijing conference in 1995 that women's rights are human rights. Dr. Hudson takes this the next step, which is women's security is national security. The point that you were making, Dr. Seaman, these are not nice to have. They are vital for a stable society and a stable country. Yeah, one of the few good things I did at the Bush School when I was dean was I stole Valerie Hudson to come to the Bush School, where she currently is still there teaching and writing. Some of you may know her women's stats project. She's in an era of quantification, she is also a quantifier. But if you want to take a look at that, all of the stuff in her published works is backed up by reams of statistics. And I thumped that particular tub because of my own personal conviction that until we in this country get to a position of gender equity and equality, we're not going to do too much, I'm afraid, of a sustained and dynamic effort in support of other communities, Americans, Hispanics, and so forth. If you can't get it right for half the population, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting it right for 13% of the population. Great to be joined by my comrade, Dave Petraeus. I was thinking, Dave, as you spoke, particularly on the issue of drawdowns and troop levels, about 177 hours of interrogation that you and I jointly faced in September of 2007, testifying before the House and Senate Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committees. Kennedy Brown Jackson actually got off easy. We steadfastly refused to be drawn on that particular point. That for how long will we maintain these force levels? Well, as long as we need to. But we would not be pushed into that particular box, again, for the reasons that Dave cited so eloquently. It doesn't work if you tell your enemy how long he's got to hold out, and that's effectively what I think President Obama was forced into in his announcement of the surge and the withdrawal in the same statement. It's, I think, internal party politics kind of forced his hand on that, but it's a fundamental point, and I think just a crucial one. So I was there in the early days, just after Bonn, to open up our embassy. And I had a relatively free hand to set in motion whatever looked like it might need to be set in motion. Hampered only slightly by the fact that I really knew little to nothing about Afghanistan. I was a Near East guy. And the way our tribes divide up the State Department, the Near East tribe, our final frontier going east is the is the Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan border. Afghanistan and Pakistan are considered by us South Asia, not Near East. What we did in those first days, I think became hallmarks for some of the policies we would follow later on, and I do think made a lasting impact. Female education. We had girls' schools up and running, what we talked about it at the time, January 2002 in Kabul. I don't know how long it took us outside of Kabul.
Yeah, March 22nd, we announced generally.
Yeah. So that was we got it on that what had happened to females in Afghanistan was a fundamental strategic issue. So Congress comes to visit. Normally they go to nice places, which if I go to not nice places, I always appreciated that. The first congressional visitor I hosted in January of 2002 was Senator Biden, then chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he came out, he spent a couple of days with us, which is unusual for someone of his prominence, but he understood the importance. I took him to a girls' school in Kabul that was up, first grade class, and the kids ranged in age from 6 to 12, because the 12-year-olds had come of school age when the Taliban rode into Kabul. I never had the chance. And I asked one of the older girls if it bothered her to be, sitting next to a kid literally half her age and half her size. She just beamed at me and said, "I'm just so happy I'm in school. I don't care who else is here. I'm here." And that was a consistent theme, I think, of our policy in Afghanistan. We put a high premium on education. And I'm not too sure the numbers anymore. Less than 1 million kids in school when the Taliban were in power, all of them boys, no girls, to something like, 8 million total, close to 40% female. Well, I'm here to tell you that's a big deal. It's if you're talking about long-term change and engagement, but it doesn't come from us ultimately. It has to come from within, and to provide educational opportunities, again, particularly for females. That's a game changer. If you can stick with it long enough to be sure it takes. And that, of course, is what we didn't do. Stick with it long enough. And as I kind of go back over what I did or didn't do, sometime since the disaster of last August, I find myself wondering, well, hell, maybe we never should have taken that step. If we're not going to see it through, should we even start it? The answer to that from me personally is still yes, we should. You can't get into a crystal ball that's going to tell you what's going to happen 20 years down the line. You can simply do what you think is important and is viable in the context in which you're operating. I remember a lot of things that you were involved in, Dr. Seema, the conference that you staged and we helped with the cleanup on. Thanks again, largely to you at that critical early period. That the issue of women's rights and women's education was a top level political issue. Then Chairman Karzai opened that conference. because you told them you were going to open the conference. And you did. There's a real character out there, Gulag Shirzai, who was the named governor of Kandahar then, and later became governor up in Jalalabad. He gave a great political speech about how he had been a champion of women's rights during the Taliban, before the Taliban, prior to Islam, before there were even women. And it gave him a good dose of laughter from all of us in the audience, but it also underscored a point that at that moment, not just Afghanistan, but everyone was seized with the issue of female empowerment. The hard little bit is then how do you sustain that and build on it? But when I think of the negative impacts of this disastrous withdrawal, I think a lot about that. And I'd sure like to hear some ideas of what can be done moving forward to ameliorate some of the worst aspects of this, but it's not looking real good. And one of the things that bothered me, and thank you for this opportunity, because, to be doing this with a trained psychologist cost me about $100 an hour. I'm feeling better already. We had the capacity, the sustainment of a relatively small force, military force, was keeping things together. Talk more about this when I get to sum up at the end, when no one can then take the floor to say what rot. Profoundly discouraged about a lot of things, but particularly about progressives in this country. You did not hear any major progressive voices speaking out after April, when President Biden announced that we were going to zero and we're going to do it by 9/11. What lovely symmetry. No major progressive figure spoke out to say, don't do it. It is our minimal military presence, which is kind of keeping things glued together. We have dropped down to a minimal force. Taliban still do not control a single provincial capital. Girls' schools are still in operation. But I found that for progressives, that their dislike of the American military and the view that they can't possibly do anything that's really good, I think overcame a sense of solidarity with females who were going to get it really bad. The other area where I think we made a significant difference would be in healthcare. We did see particularly infant and mother mortality drop hugely, but overall were drops in mortality across the board and corresponding increases in life expectancy. Where we could have done better in the healthcare area, something that Alyssa referred to, the building clinics without having the assurance, the guarantee that there would be staff to run them. And to be sure that we were linking up, say, educational efforts to clinic construction, putting resources into healthcare management, training more Afghans than we did in those areas, not to emulate our superb healthcare system here in this country, but hopefully to do something that was long-term and sustainable. Where we did not do well at all, of course, was the brick and mortar stuff. For Afghanistan, if it's any consolation, we did even worse in Iraq because there was more money. That is not for the future. Don't do bricks and mortar, really, unless it's something that is tied to a larger project, like, again, schools and healthcare facilities in places where it makes sense to have them. As Dave Petraeus said, well, yeah, it's kind of hard not to do nation building if you really do want to eradicate the conditions that produced your intervention in the first place. Now, Afghanistan was the kind of the first test of the what I call the Rumsfeld doctrine. Use of minimum force level to get the needful done, oust the Taliban in this case, and then no follow-on role. We're done. That was our mission. We're done. Pull everybody out. And if in 5 or 10 years you get another regime that is a threat to us, we'll do it again. But don't get bogged down in endless tasks of nation building. I don't share that view, but there was a logic to it and that gets at your point, I think, and it betrays point. So what's the long-term strategy? And I'll talk more about this as we sum up. In terms of development and corruption. So here's the thing in my experience in both Iraq and in Afghanistan. In a traumatized society, traumatized because there's just been a war, and a situation in which the old institutions are gone, if they were ever there, where there is no broadly accepted rule of law or means to enforce it. In other words, that you were dealing down at primal levels, family and tribe, maybe sub-tribe, but nothing above that. And then you inject large sums of money, bake for 3 seconds, and you have major corruption. It would happen anywhere. It's not specific to Afghanistan or Iraq. It would happen in this country. We've had our own interesting history again, weak institutions and lack of respect for rule of law up well into the 20th century. So, to build back better, it's a great phrase, maybe the administration. You got to take those things into account. And it's that imperative we have as Americans, do it quick and do it big. And we've really got to rethink that as we move into the future. Politically, when I was set to go out as ambassador in 2011, I called on President Obama, who said, do 2 things: reset the relationship with Hamid Karzai, which was in tatters by that point. He and I had a good relationship during the brief period I was there at the beginning of the interim authority. I think he put in a good word for me at one point with him. Thank you. I had several meetings with President Karzai and the minister, which were quite notable for the finger waving and pointing you did at him and the way he took it. When I tried it, it didn't work nearly as well.
No, he was at least listening.
Yes, he was. So reset that relationship and then negotiate a long-term, multifaceted strategic agreement between the United States and Afghanistan. And, the one led to the other, and that agreement was signed by President Obama, who flew to Kabul to do it. It was pretty important to him and his administration at the time. Unfortunately, we kind of lost the thread on that one in subsequent years. How that came about is interesting, and I'll just conclude on that because I think it's fundamental to how we can engage, if not totally effectively, at least not mucking it up worse than it already is in complex cultures. The negotiations started in Washington and went nowhere. So they punted it out to us in Kabul to run, and I was the senior negotiator. And relevant, I think, to this audience in particular, if you are setting up a major negotiation that is fundamentally political in its thrust, do not have it run by a lawyer. of course, critically important that lawyers be part of that team. But if it's political, you get somebody from the political side to do it. And it's just a huge difference. And so I was that for us. When I went to tell President Karzai that ball now in our court to do this thing, and he said, okay, good. So what the first thing I got to do here is organize a big old Loya Jirga that's going to bring in absolutely everybody to talk about an agreement and set out their views and concerns and ideas. And I said, boss, you know, we don't have an agreement. I mean, we haven't even started negotiations. And he said, I basically said, I know what I'm doing. He said, Sigmatola Mujadidi, Professor Mujadidi, is the guy to run it. But if I ask him, he won't do it because he hates me. But if you ask him, he will do it because he likes America. So I go to see Professor Mujadidi and I say, Professor, President Karzai would like you to convene a Loya Jirga on our long-term relationship. And he said, I hate him. Why would I do that? And I said, you'd be doing it for us. And he said, oh, okay. We can play that critical role of catalyst or mediator, intermediary, whatever you want to call it, between some thinking folks, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else, who simply cannot work together and make concessions, can't make compromises, because a compromise is a concession and a concession is a defeat and defeat is death. And this is, I mean, really lots of dead people out there. So that's the role we can play. What we cannot do, but we do it all the time, not just in Afghanistan, is decide that we've got these great American ideas, and if these people will just simply sit down and listen carefully, and if they don't understand English, say it again in English, but more slowly and louder, because heaven forfend that we should actually learn somebody else's language. So we had that big old Loya Jirga, and I can't remember how many committees and subcommittees there were. It produced about 173 recommendations. And President Karzai calls me in after it's all over and say, well, it's yours to lose. The people have had their input. They have been consulted. They have produced recommendations. And we now have a free hand to carry this any way we want to. And that's right. So again, the Loya Jirga is a unique institution in Afghanistan. If you don't have ready-made institutions or laws, go with the traditional. I mean, it's, you know, we don't run Loya Jirgas, thank God. We don't have any idea how to, or we would have tried. But if a country's leaders has an idea, it's probably going to be better than yours. You know, you're the outsider. So those were a couple of the takeaways I had. And I'll cut that off because we're already deep into overtime.
Thank you so much. Now we'll take some questions from people who wanted to speak from the audience, and then we'll go into the final comment. So why don't you speak?
Yeah. Do I need to stand up to see you?
Sure.
My name is Sarina Faizi, and I'm from Kandahar, Afghanistan. I was the former provincial council member for Afghanistan, and I got graduation here in Master of Law from Mary College. I have one question that has two parts, and hopefully I will get answer today. One question that before August 2021, everything was open back in Afghanistan. If we talk about the embassy of USA, or we talk about the special forces of USA or NATO or RS was present there, and all the intelligence was there. They were not able, I would say, to provide any good information with their intelligence for the president here. to lead him through that decision that he need to pull, back from Afghanistan and withdraw all the, military back in Afghanistan or not. That leads to one of the decision made a big cause, and the word was witness, witness of the cause of Afghan people. How we would be able now, since we don't have embassy, we don't have any special forces other than the UN office open in just in Kabul, not even in some of the provinces. How we would be able to get that information from Afghanistan while we don't have anybody in the ground? Everybody who work with the USA is out of Afghanistan. That's one question. And the second part of that question is, as an educated Afghan girl, it really kind of emotionally hurts me to even talk about that. What do you think about the decision that made, by Taliban 3 days ago about the girls, closing doors for girls after 6th grade? And I'm a master, like I got my master's degree here in America, but it does not mean that we have to close our eyes on the, people or girls back in Afghanistan. What is the concrete plan for them? What is, other than just one Facebook post or a Twitter post from the UN, what is the action? I'm sure, people are, just looking for one of the action to lead through them and join them with that action. If they're in Afghanistan or they're out of Afghanistan, we haven't heard anything yet regarding the, anywhere. What is going to be a concrete plan for those women? We don't want to go back, waste and have different projects for Afghan women for 21 years to get where we are right now. So, and what about the people who are right now in all over countries? What is their future? Who were worked in a really high position right now? They're working in a different position in a really low level because of not having skills of, skills of language or, normal understanding of the culture. Thank you.
Well, I think maybe the first question, General Petraeus, if you want to take on that question, is how can we even find out what is happening now in Afghanistan without people on the ground there, without really much in the way of international organizations, especially in the provinces, so that our government can make decisions? What would be, are we able to learn anything at all, or are we really in the dark?
No, there are undoubtedly various quote sources and methods that provide some insights into what's going on. There are plenty of reporters. There are partner embassies that are there. I should note, first of all, I'm very sympathetic to the issues raised. I've suggested that we should actually reoccupy the embassy. I don't understand why you don't have to recognize a country. I don't think, Ryan, do you, would we have to have people back in the embassy? Think what is frankly, in my view, a much bigger issue is that we have said rhetorically, repeatedly, that we care deeply about those that we have left behind, which include well over 60,000 who qualified for the special immigrant visa by serving 2 years or more with our forces on the ground in combat as translators. They and their families, it's well over 60,000 that we have names for. And yet we have done virtually nothing really to establish any kind of program to really get them out in any kind of number. That's just that very small number. There are hundreds of thousands, arguably more than that, of other individuals whose lives are at risk because of their service with us in other capacities that don't get them a special immigrant visa, or actually service with the Afghan military, intelligence services, government, and so forth. And our response to them is that we care deeply about them. We're very gravely concerned about them. And if they want to, they can apply for some form of asylum. But to do so, they actually have to get outside the country. They have to go to a US consulate in a country other than Afghanistan. And of course, they have to survive during that time physically and just in terms of sustenance and so forth with their family, while they wait for what is probably at least a year-long process with no guaranteed timetable to it, during which the State Department will make the assessment as to whether or not they get that kind of asylum. So again, I really have not understood why we literally couldn't put folks back into the embassy. I'm sure the Taliban do not want to tangle with the Americans. We could put a battalion or so around it if we have to, and have some way of ensuring security. But right now, this is, I think, wholly inadequate. And the repeated assurances about how much we care about those we have abandoned, as you put it rightly, Alyssa, ring pretty hollow at this point in time. But I'd be interested, Ryan, in whether you think we could actually put folks back into the, this $500 million embassy or whatever it is, just to keep it maintained and working, because eventually we will go back to it. But over to you, Wingman.
There's actually perhaps a rough parallel in Afghanistan when they closed our embassy as the Civil War intensified there. Our Afghan staff, a core staff, remained. And when the Taliban got to Kabul, sort of like on day 3, they wandered over to the American embassy and says to our Afghan folks there that this is now ours, step aside, we're going in. And a couple of our guards said, right, okay, give us 45 minutes. Because we want to be 45 minutes worth of kilometers down the road when you do that, because the whole thing is going to blow sky high because the Americans wired it with every kind of explosive you can even imagine. We had done no such thing. But the Taliban found that convincing, and the embassy was never breached during the period of Taliban rule. Can you do more? Well, if you're going to send in Americans as well, first, you just legally, you'll all appreciate that. You have to have some pretty direct assurances from the Taliban that they will respect the articles of the Vienna Convention concerning the security and safety of diplomats in our country. Then you're talking about something awfully like recognition. And there would also be that question, well, if you don't recognize the government, that means you're not going to have your diplomats dealing with them, presumably. What are they going to do? Work with NGOs without reference to the government? A good way for something really nasty to happen to said NGO. So it's an interesting idea and definitely worth kicking around. I just hadn't thought of it quite in those terms. And should the administration look like it want to try that, I'm their guy.
And maybe just the second question is about, are there any plans or thinking about what can be done for women and girls so that they don't lose another generation? Do you have thoughts, Dr. Samar?
Well, I think that the education should be supported in every level, in every possible way. But I think the diplomacy and put more pressure on Taliban in order to open the girls' school. I would say that it's not enough that we lobby only for opening of the girls' schools. We should lobby for human rights, otherwise, and also such are like countries who support Taliban. We know who they are, because they are the one who is still behind the scene. I was surprised that they're still holding back, not recognizing them. We have the 3 countries who recognized the Taliban during the first regime. I think there's not a big change on those policies. So we maybe some other countries who wants to be closer can use them in order to support, to push for respect for human rights, not only for girls' education, because I mean they keep saying, one of them yesterday said that when the girls going to the school, they create a lot of immorality in the society. This is the minister, I think. And why the girls? Minister of Education.
Yes.
Yeah, Myra, I think that's right.
Yeah, I can. May I? So my name is Umayr Rasuli, and I'm a human rights activist and a lawyer. Currently, I'm a visiting scholar in William and Mary. So I will start with the quote of the minister that on date 23rd of March he mentioned. So the Minister of Higher Education, Maulavi Nurullah Munir, attributed that a so-called Sharia saying that based on Sharia, girl will be educated until grade 6. More than that, it's not necessary, has they cause immorality. So the question, that come in our minds, as my friend said, during the past days, nobody could stop crying on what's going on in Afghanistan. As you know, Afghanistan at the moment going through multiple crises, humanitarian emergency, ongoing conflict, systematic and widespread human rights violation, and collapse of financial and banking system. So women and girls especially lost their fundamental rights, including rights to education, employment, and political participation. So my questions goes to Excellency Minister. The Taliban has failed to form an inclusive government. They have denied women their rights to education and their participation in social, political, and economic life. They have installed a government of fair and not a consensus. So at the rate of how long the Taliban is going, what are your considerations as how long the Taliban can sustain as a government? We as a people in Afghanistan feel, are very happy that humanitarian casualty dramatically decreased, but at the same time, we don't believe that Taliban was sustained.
Is that for Samar or I think.
I think the Taliban is not going to sustain the way they are running the country. It's not only the humanitarian crisis, in my view, it's a governance crisis, an economical crisis, of course, including the humanitarian crisis. But dealing with humanitarian crisis is not the solution for the country. It's good for the temporary life-saving of the people, but we need to find a political solution, a political way in order to solve the problem in Afghanistan. It cannot survive. What we keep complaining that yes, the Taliban are exclusive and they are violent, but they cannot really sustain their government if they are not going for a political solution with an inclusive solution for the country. So I don't know. I think it's Minister Sanazai can answer the question because he was leading the negotiation with Taliban.
My question also refers to Sanazai, sir.
Tomorrow.
I think it is a very good question. And I think one of the reasons that during the negotiation with Taliban, we have discussed the 4 key fundamental principles. And we were stressing on that because we were asked by the Loya Jirga, we were asked by the civil society, by the human rights and all, many people in Afghanistan. The first, that there should be the rights of the people, the rights of women for education should be preserved and it should be granted. The constitutional order should not be disrupted. And at the same time, we also said that an institution should not be destroyed because it is a national asset and investment. And then the power sharing should be something on the basis of inclusivity so that everybody should not feel that they are in a kind of a status of feeling insecure. Coming to the question, I think one of the things that Taliban with this decision they further isolated themselves, both nationally, internationally, and regionally. If you look to the statement that was issued yesterday by the OIC, I think that the first item that came in that statement from the Islamic countries is the right for education, for inclusivity, and all these things. Secondly, I think you will be surprised that for the first time, those people who were supporting the Taliban has, for the first time, started to criticize of this decision and the kind of a commitment they made with for the education of the girls, but they revoked that decision. And I think that they come under a lot of kind of criticism from their own supporters there, in some in the rank and file as well, although they are very kind of a strict discipline and they cannot say anything. But there are people who had said publicly about this issue. Thirdly, I think if you categorize those people who are with the Taliban, people who are the ordinary people of Afghanistan, and also the politician or opposition and other people, I think all together, for the first time, they have come together with this cry of the Afghan people, the right for education, and that emotion, as I mentioned in the beginning, that I haven't seen that kind of emotion and support for the education of Afghan girls never in the past. So for that reason, I think the diplomatic pressure or the diplomatic efforts, plus the social pressure is more kind of getting a momentum. And I think this will come together as something that has to bring that change. But it is depending on the situation, how the complex situation will shape in the future in and around Afghanistan. It is a very difficult situation, and I think if the people who are not listening to themselves, how you can make them to listen to others. But we should not lose the hope. We have to continue. Only with weeping and crying, we will not achieve anything. We have to continue the struggle for the betterment.
I think we can probably take one more question. You had a question?
It's somewhat related, thank you. Reuben, law professor and formerly co-counsel for Bosnia-Herzegovina before the World Court in the genocide case. And Afghanistan is a party to all the major human rights treaties, but not the optional protocols which allow for individual complaints and complaints by NGOs. But there are other legal options in the UN system. So what legal steps are states taking trying to ensure that the Taliban provides fundamental, or are they not?
Yes, I think it's a pressure should be put by Taliban from all sides, because Afghanistan signed the 7 major convention of human rights, and they have an obligation to fulfill that. Not only those conventions, but even before that, I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they have to implement that Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the country. Otherwise, well, beside condemnation, it should be other measures to pressurize them. That can be any other, it's more depend on the different countries, how they do. But the reality is, what I'm afraid personally is that the current situation in Ukraine, as I said, that I feel the solidarity with the people in Ukraine has really undermined the whole situation of Afghanistan. People are not talking anymore about Afghanistan. And I would say that the problem in Afghanistan will not stay again in our boundary. It will reach, and I think we all have to lobby for that, the implementation of the human rights in the country. If they really apply or implement the human rights principle in the country, most of the problem will be solved automatically. And we should take that seriously and mention it. I mean, when we see during the talks and different issues, human rights is hardly mentioned and the different statements and so on.
Well, thank you. I think now we'll have Ambassador Crocker bring all of these many ideas together into one coherent and synthetic whole. And then we'll have to sit down and come back about 75 more times to really understand what should happen. Ambassador Crocker.
So why does it matter? So in my experience as a foreign service officer, I regularly was faced with, as are all of our foreign service officers, some contradictions in our policies. On the one hand, we are there to advance core and critical national security interests of the United States, be that in defense or trade or other sectors. But on the other hand, we represent a nation founded on universal values. As you rightly said, Doctor, it's human rights apply to all humans. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not unique goals for the United States. We're really the only major country that has this kind of friction between principles and ideals and national security. They're hard to reconcile, or can be very hard to reconcile. And that was one of the things that made the Afghan situation special, where we saw some really important intersections, where we were in a position where we had agency to create an environment, for example, where folks like Dr. Seema, not without a whole lot of personal courage, could set forth policies for the new Afghan nation that did respect human rights, that and its subsidiaries like rights for girls and women, that it is about national security at the end of the day, how females are treated. So we had agency for once. For once, we didn't have that tough contradiction of, well, we got to get along with the ruler of Egypt, even though he's doing some pretty awful things to his own people. We don't have agency in Egypt to assist with a different kind of effort. We did in Afghanistan, and we gave it away. I mean, we weren't forced out. We just decided we didn't want to do it anymore. So for me, at least, and I'm heavily invested in it, I acknowledge it was a betrayal of our, our values as Americans. To simply say, well, we tried. Probably not going to go so well for you, but geez, look at the time. We got to be going. And yeah, Alyssa, your esteemed newspaper did an editorial. I guess it was about the time of the Biden announcement, sort of about how that was the right thing to do. And I think kind of on paragraph 9 of that editorial, oh, well, there are going to be some not good things as a result, like what might happen to women and girls. But who knows, maybe China will step up, or even Pakistan. That was pretty awful. In terms of hard national security, the moral argument then, well, it's what Dave has said, what Bill Burns, the current director of the CIA, has said, our intelligence on terrorist threats in and around Afghanistan is significantly degraded, and it's pretty obvious. If you don't have people on the ground, you are not going to get the kind of intelligence that you can when you are there. And again, this is a movie we've seen before. It's not hypothetical. 9/11 actually happened, and it was carried out by individuals, not Afghans, Arabs in Afghanistan, Al Qaeda, that were sheltered by the Taliban. It happened. And we have now set the stage where that could happen again. Take it to the regional level. We have talked a bit about Pakistan and its role. I had the privilege of being ambassador to Pakistan as well as for 3 years, as well as ambassador to Afghanistan. And in between, I was ambassador to Iraq. So I had the post 9/11 trifecta from hell. One of our major problems, again, it's our strategic impatience and short tours. As I got into my third year in Pakistan, I actually was starting to learn some stuff about the place and develop some relationships where I could have some very honest conversation on tough issues with the Pakistanis. Here's a version of their national security narrative. During the Soviet occupation of the 1980s, the US and Pakistan were the most allied of allies. You did the training. We identified trainees from Afghanistan, provided space in the Northwest frontier for the training to take place. And together, we defeated the Soviet Union. But once that was done, you looked at your watch and you said, oh, got to be going. We achieved our strategic objective, and so we're done. On the way out the door, we stopped getting waivers of what is called the Pressler Amendment after Senator Pressler, which stipulated that there could be no US government assistance, economic or security, to any country pursuing a nuclear weapons program. Well, that was Pakistan and India. But through the 80s, we got waivers each year. And the Soviets left. We didn't apply for waivers any longer. So again, in their narrative, they went from being the most allied of allies to the most sanctioned of adversaries. And as they saw, and as we saw, without a common enemy to hold the major Afghan elements together, take that away, there's going to be a big old civil war, which there was. So goes the Pakistani narrative. You were gone, we're here. Afghanistan has erupted. We got some stability challenges of our own, never mind that they created most of them. So now you're back after 9/11, and we're happy to work with you on Al-Qaeda. But if you think you're going to convince us to turn the Afghan Taliban into our mortal enemy, you are completely crazy, because we know what you're going to do. It's leave. And they were right. But that's not the end of the story. They spent about 15 minutes, I suppose, doing high fives at Army headquarters in Rawalpindi and Government House in Islamabad. And then they confronted the new reality that the Afghan Taliban narrative of defeating the infidel, clad only in the armor of the one true faith, was going to resonate throughout not just the region, but the world. That's your point, Dr.
Exactly.
It's going to give a lot of encouragement to groups like the Pakistani Taliban, which does not aim at regime change in Afghanistan. It aims at regime change in Pakistan. We've already seen some statements. We've seen some attacks. There is a unprecedented vote of no confidence coming up against the Pakistani Prime Minister. So I think that is one of the why does this matter points. What happens next in Pakistan? Through a complex of reasons, the Pakistanis not having the manpower that the Indian military does has put a lot of focus on its military nuclear arsenal down to the battlefield, tactical nuclear weapons. So what happens if Pakistan starts to come apart? As a country of what, 220 million people with those nukes? I think that's a challenge to our national security. You bet it is. And it could happen. Aided and abetted by our decision to basically hand the Taliban a victory. It's also going to resonate in India. Kind of a perfect storm there, where Prime Minister Modi's policies in Indian Kashmir have thoroughly alienated that population, who are perking up now that they see this great success that the Afghan Taliban have wrought. The jihadi groups that Pakistan created and supported after partition and lost control of. Watch that space across the Indian border. I think you're going to start seeing things blow up there. Leading to what kind of retaliation? Well, the Pakistanis were pretty sober about that accidental missile launch. I'm not sure the Indians will return the favor if there's another Mumbai attack. And the odds of that happening have increased. China. If you've been in Afghanistan or looked at a map, you know, there's this little tiny sliver of land, this finger up in the far northeast, called the Wakhan Corridor, put there so the Russian and the British empires would not quite touch each other, and puts China really literally on the Afghan border. Now they have launched their genocidal campaign against their own Muslim population in the West. Well, all those folks were tuned in too for, you know, Radio Free Taliban's broadcast of strategic victory. So I think there's every chance you're going to see stuff starting to pop in Western China. So it is the gift that is going to keep on giving, I'm afraid. We're distracted by Ukraine. And we're not going to talk about that, obviously. And I do not underestimate its significance for international security one bit. But I think it does put a cloud over Afghanistan. We're not focused there anymore. Well, again, it's Dave was kind enough to recall my movie adage, which is only understood by people who are 50 anyway. There were real movies that were actually on reels. But whether we're there or whether we're not there, the film is going to keep on running. And I do not see it coming to a happy ending anytime soon, like forever. But that's too pessimistic. So what I would say is, and I think you were getting at this, both you and Minister Stanek's eye, that it ain't the end of the movie. A lot of us reflexively look, I think, to the Taliban takeover in the mid-90s as an example of what's next. I think the Iranian Revolution might be more apt, actually. Who's really got power? Because it's a very different dynamic now. You have at least 3 different Talibans, I suppose. The Quetta Shura in Pakistan / Haqqani net, the Doha boys, and the guys on the ground who actually did the fighting. I don't think the Taliban has sorted out who's running Afghanistan yet, and we may see factional fighting start at some point. Sirajuddin Haqqani now has taken up residence in the women's ministry, right?
No, he's the Minister of Interior, but Vice and Virtue.
Oh, Vice and Virtue is in it. Yeah. So it just shows you that the Taliban is not completely without a sense of humor. What you got now in Afghanistan may not be what you're looking at a year from now. All of that to say, over the long run, we may see things happen inside Afghanistan that will give those who hope for a better Afghanistan among Afghanis themselves and their supporters may provide some windows, some potential levers to move in a different direction. The Taliban are there now. Which Taliban and what will they be doing next? We see these Islamic State attacks going forward. But that's about as good as I can do in the optimism department. you know, 20 years down the line, we might get to a better place. But those 2 decades to come are going to make the 2 decades that have gone by since 2001 look awfully good. Inshallah.
Thank you.
We of course want to extend our thanks again to this incredible group of people who have devoted a weekend, not to mention today, to this. And I have a request. General Petraeus and Your Excellency, Asum Staniksai, could you stay on for 5 minutes? Because we just want to do a couple of group pictures down here. And since you're on, we want you in. And if everybody else could kind of segue outside the reception, it's going to be, you'll have time to talk to everybody. So don't worry, we just want to get some pictures for the main campus. But if you could like move up a little so our photographer could.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll just do it in a way.
Oh, no.
I never know what you're interested in.
Well, thank you very much.
We do that all the time.
Yes, ma'am.
But I think did not answer.
All right, I'm going to take 3 pictures here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Beautiful.
Good.
Thank you. That is the widest ranging picture I've ever taken.